Hi there, this is CRP, and this is my birthday webinar. These webinars are usually for Patreon. In fact, this is appearing on Patreon on February 28th, 2021. But I'm also going to be releasing this on my CRP channel and my GL channel because, for my birthday webinar, I wanted to talk about something that I'm interested in. Most of the webinars I do on Patreon, all of the webinars I do on Patreon, as a matter of fact, are about subjects that I know my audience is going to be interested in. Usually something that I have figured out. I figured out because of experience, quite frankly. And it's usually the kind of stuff that, were I younger, I would have liked to have had someone tell me about them. But this birthday webinar is going to be more self-indulgent. I'm going to be talking about my favorite rock band, Rush, the Canadian trio that was releasing albums between 1974 and 2012 and eventually disbanded in 2015. They are a band that I first listened to when I was 12 years old, and I'm 53, and I still find their music rich and interesting and fascinating. And I'm going to discuss why. I think that Rush is a really important band. I think that 100 years from now, people are going to be discussing the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Rush, and quite possibly not even paying that much attention to the Rolling Stones, to tell you the truth. Rush is that important, and I know that you listening to me now, even if you're diehard Rush fans, you're going to say that I'm full of it, that I'm full of shit, and that no way is Rush more important than, say, Led Zeppelin or countless other major bands. But I'm telling you, Rush is it. Rush is the game. Rush is where it's at. And I'm going to explain why. And hopefully by the end of this webinar, you'll see my point of view. I'm also going to be discussing why Rush as a band mattered to me personally in my development as an individual, and why their music, their lyrics, their general ideas help me to understand the hypocrisy and fakeness of so much of mainstream society. And I think that what I lived through of seeing how Rush was denigrated by so many different outlets, the press and whatnot, it red-pilled me in a way that retrospectively is really remarkable, because it was the first taste of how the mainstream belief on something was so radically different from what I was perceiving to be the truth of that something. And so, anyway, I'll get to that in just a minute. Let's get started with the basics. Why Rush matters. Rush were formed in 1968 in Toronto, Canada. It was started by a guitar player called Alex Lifeson, who at the time was 16 years old. And he quickly went through a bunch of different members and whatnot, like teenage bands usually do. But by 1972, it was pretty much settled as to who was in the band. It was a guy called Geddy Lee who was singing and playing bass, Alex Lifeson on guitars and backing vocals, and a guy called John Rutsey who was playing drums. By 1975, shortly after the release of Rush's first album, titled Rush, John Rutsey had left the band, and a replacement was found, and that replacement was a guy named Neil Peart. For years, I thought that his name was pronounced Peart, but no, from the man himself, it was Peart, even though it's spelled P-E-A-R-T. Anyway, in 1975, he joined the band, and they went on to record all the subsequent albums together, Lee, Lifeson, and Peart. Usually the division of labor was straightforward. Lee and Lifeson would write the music, and Peart would write the lyrics. All three of them would participate in the arrangement of the songs. The arrangements became exceptionally important for this band, as I'll explain in a moment. And they all co-produced the album, usually bringing in an outside producer to sort of look over their shoulder, as it were. They were three alienated, uncool weirdos. I mean, they had long hair and they looked like rock stars, but they started talking and they just came across as weirdos, as uncool. They were uncool people. They were exceptionally disciplined musicians, all three of them. And they just stuck to their craft, and they just didn't know how to be the cool rock stars. Probably because all three of them got married very young. I mean, Lifeson, who started the group, he got married by the time he was 18 or something like that. He had his first kid when he was 17 with his wife, his still wife. Geddy Lee also, he got married young. He had a kid as a young man. And so they were very uncool, very disciplined musicians. And also, they realized that what they were doing was a business. They were professional musicians, and they had to earn a living as musicians. They didn't have any other opportunities. They had finished high school, although I don't think that all of them had finished high school. I think Lifeson actually dropped out, but I'm not sure about that. It doesn't really matter. The point is, they didn't have any other opportunities. They didn't have anything to fall back on. This was it for them. And so they were professional musicians, and they really started doing gigs in 1972. Professional gigs, consistent gigs. And by 1974, they'd released their first album, Rush, which was a collection of Zeppelin-esque kind of tunes. And I'll get to the music in just a moment, but I want to give a background first. Their first album came out in 74. Their first album with Peart came out in February of 75. In fact, Peart joined them in August of 74 for a U.S. tour that they were doing in support of Kiss. And they kept on releasing albums from 74 all the way up to 2012. In total, they released 20 studio albums. 19 of those studio albums were all original material, not a single cover song in all of those 19 albums. And that extra 20th album, called Feedback, which was released, I believe, in 2005, was an album of only covers. They covered all these songs that they played in their heyday as teenagers and playing in bars in the Toronto area, and which is pretty funny. But anyway, they toured relentlessly. They were a band that believed that only by way of touring could they build a fan base. For over a decade, they did more than 100 shows per year. In total, between 1972 and 2015, they did 2,400 shows, which is an unbelievable number. Anybody who's a musician will tell you that number of shows is just unheard of. But that's the kind of band that Rush was. They toured relentlessly. And as a band, they always did their own music, never what the label wanted. They had a production deal with their label, and the deal was basically they would deliver to the label a finished album. The label did not have the right to go to the studio and check out what they were doing. They had total autonomy insofar as their music, and they earned that with their fourth album, 2112. But I'll get to that in a moment. They were really interesting in that regard because, you see, ever since the start, they marched to their own drummer. Yeah, they were really their own men insofar as the kind of music that they were doing. The kind of music that they did throughout their career was always the kind of music that at that time was unpopular. And that's the thing that sort of like sets Rush apart. They did the uncool music, the music that was not top 40 radio at that time, and yet there was an audience for it. And retrospectively, it's music that stood the test of time precisely because it didn't follow the fashion of the day. The writer A.N. Wilson once pointed out that Queen Elizabeth II, in every picture ever taken of her, she always looks like Queen Elizabeth II, whereas everybody around her looks like they're dressed up in out-of-date clothes, out-of-fashion clothes, right? Because all those people around Queen Elizabeth were dressed fashionably for that time, whereas Queen Elizabeth was just wearing her own unique clothes. You could call it dowdy or grandmotherly, it doesn't really matter. The point is that her clothes were completely out of fashion, and that's why retrospectively she looks timeless, whereas retrospectively, looking at old pictures, all the people around her look a little bit foolish. And that's what happened with Rush. They did their own music. They did not really follow fashions in terms of the kind of music they were doing, the production values of the music that they were doing. It just seemed out of step with the times. And that's why when you listen to it now, decades after the release of much of this material, you're like, whoa, this seems fresh, this seems new, it seems timeless. That's why. And that's interesting. That's something to think about if you're a creative, if you're somebody who's doing creative work, especially if you're a professional doing creative work. Anyway, is Rush a major band in popular music? Absolutely. There's no question about it. Anybody who claims otherwise, they don't know what they're talking about. They had album sales worldwide of about 42 million units. That's top 100 of all time bands. They had more consecutive gold and platinum albums than any band except the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. They had gold and platinum albums for over 5 decades. They had gold and platinum albums in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and they had a gold album, I think, in the 2010s, which is when the whole music industry was fading anyway, and very few artists were picking up platinum albums. But still, that record of being able to do that over 5 decades, holy cow. I think maybe the Stones are the only ones who come close to that. Now, they were, the three of them, Lee, Lifeson, and Peart, they were extraordinary musicians. They were considered by other musicians to be among the best ever. Okay? I mean, you look at best of lists in guitar, in bass, in drums, in keyboard. All three of them are up there in the top 100. And it's noticeable for Alex Lifeson as the guitarist. He's up there on the Rolling Stone list at number 98, I believe. But, guitars have always been flashier. And the ego drive of the guitarist makes for more guitar heroes. Insofar as bassists and drummers, Geddy Lee and Neil Peart have always been in the top 5 in their instruments, always. I mean, ever since like the late 70s, early 80s, when they finally broke through, as I'll explain in a moment. They've always been up there. And that the key issue, of course, is what other musicians think, because most critics are not musicians, so they don't really know what's difficult and what's easy. But musicians do, and it's musicians who have consistently argued that Lee, Lifeson, and Peart are standouts in their respective instruments rather. I mean, standouts in the sense that they're kind of like up there, untouchable, in that nebulous greatest ever. Because you get to a certain point, and how do you really compare, say, Jimi Hendrix and Eddie Van Halen? I mean, they're both incredibly good. They're just different kinds of great. So yeah, you can't say that there's any one greatest guitarist or bassist or drummer ever, but you can say that there is a set of the greatest ever. And the three members of Rush were the greatest ever, among the greatest ever in their respective instruments, rather, excuse me. I don't know why I keep replacing instruments by industry. Anyway, they're considered among the best of their instruments by the other musicians who played that instrument. Okay? So that's important. They influenced everybody. I mean, Metallica, Trent Reznor, that's Nine Inch Nails, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Smashing Pumpkins, Nirvana. I mean, just about any band post 1980 was seriously influenced by Rush. And a lot of them say how when they were growing up, they actually tried or actually did learn how to play certain touchstones, certain songs done by Rush, specifically 2112. Most every rock star, every rock drummer, every rock guitarist has tried to learn to play 2112. 2112 came off Rush's 4th album, and I'll be discussing the albums in detail in just a moment. But see, the musicians, they all tried to learn that when they were growing up, when they were all teenagers. And Gene Simmons of Kiss said it best that, see, the music that impacts you the most is the music you heard as a teenager when you were like 13, 15, 17. That's the music that really marks you. And that's very true. And so these musicians who went on to form these major bands, they all listened to Rush when they were teenagers. They all tried to copy Rush. They didn't try to copy Rush because Rush were cool. They weren't. Even the biggest fans of Rush will tell you that they were always uncool. They were always just a little dorky, a little bit just, no, not cool. Not cool like Jimi Hendrix or Eddie Van Halen, They just didn't have that coolness factor. But they did have the chops. They did have the feel. They did have that ability in their instruments. And it was expressed in their music. And that's why so many musicians, popular musicians, and for some exceedingly big bands, are huge Rush fans and were influenced by them. Hell, all of these bands that I mentioned, at different times, they played little riffs or little nods to Rush in concert, because Rush was their band and Rush formed them and influenced them, okay? Now, musicians, as opposed to rappers, DJs, or programmers, have a deep reference for Rush, which means that they'll always be studied and admired by creators of popular music. That's a fact. Rush is over. Their last album was in 2012, their last concert in 2015. Neil Peart died in January of 2020 of brain cancer. Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson are 68 years old, 69 years old this year. I hope that they both live long lives, but their music career is pretty much over. But musicians are always going to be listening to their music and always copying them and learning from them, and that's why they're always going to have an impact on popular music. On top of that, a lot of programmers and DJs and rappers are influenced by Rush because they use so many little bits of them and samples and whatnot, because so much of their music was cool. The music was cool. They weren't. But anyway, the key importance of Rush, the reason that they actually matter, okay, is that they evolved. And they evolved in a way that is incredible, okay? The leap that they made from album to album, each album that they made, and they released these albums almost relentlessly one year after the next for a bit, each album was a step up. It was more complex, more interesting musicianship, more interesting arrangements, better production, better songwriting, better lyrics. Everything increased with every album that they released. And the only band that comes close to Rush in terms of absolute musical development, but doesn't surpass them, is the Beatles. Rush evolved more than any band in popular music history, certainly more than any band that's in the top 100 or top 500 bands of all times. Not even the Beatles come close to the development of Rush, how they grew and evolved. The biggest artistic growth of any popular band, I would argue, happened between the song Bytor and the Snow Dog, that was released in the Fly By Night album in 1975, and the album Power Windows in 1985. In those 10 years, Rush went through a cataclysmic, an extraordinary growth, a change, an evolution that's like unprecedented. Nothing comes close to it. In 1975, the three members of Rush were 22 and 23 years old in that area. And that's when they released Bytor and the Snow Dog, which is this long, epic, some people love it, some people hate it. That's not the point. It's this long, complicated epic, but it's, it's Zeppelin-esque. It's like Cream. It's like that kind of blues heavy metal. And Power Windows was a completely different beast 10 years later when they were 32 and 33 years old, respectively. They had evolved so incredibly between those 10 years, between those two milestones. And that's why they matter, because as you listen to them, you see the evolution. You see three artists fully committed to their instruments, committed to their craft, committed to their songwriting, how they evolved and grew and became extraordinary. Those 10 years are the big ones. Before that, they were children. And after that, they continued on, they continued developing, but not with the brilliance of those 10 years. Those 10 years, that was it. That was the pinnacle of Rush. And so that takes me to the next point. Let's talk about the albums of Rush, the stages of Rush, okay? Now, between 72, when they started being a professional band, when they started doing gigs on the regular, and 1975, that's when they were basically Canadian Zeppelin. They were writing catchy but simple songs, heavy metal songs, of course. These songs had been filtered um, via Cream and Zeppelin from old blues. Yeah. They were like Jimi Hendrix-esque kind of things, Zeppelin-esque. Yeah. These songs that they were doing in the first two albums, Rush and Fly By Night, they were, straight ahead heavy metal, but they were flirting with more complex arrangements. Even in the first one, before Neil Peart joined the band, there are songs that are a little more complex, that they're trying for a little bit more. There are songs that, are almost kissing thrash metal, I mean, they're like trying out different things. Even in the first album, it's sort of like they were trying to expand what they could do. Mm? The first album, Rush, was recorded over like 3 nights in a studio in Toronto, and it was recorded at night because at nighttime the studio time was cheaper. And it's just a Canadian Zeppelin, yeah. And the standout song of that album is the 8-minute epic "Working Man." That's a very simple Zeppelin-esque song that has this monster instrumental break, okay? And where Lifeson is really showing off what a great guitar player he was. And the key issue is that, see, at this point, Lifeson is clearly the prime mover of the band. He is pushing it forward. His sound dominates the band in Rush and even in Fly By Night. Fly By Night, that's when Neil Peart came on, and he whacked the hell out of drums. He was a hard-hitting drummer, and he liked doing big fills. He would do these big fills and these splashy, little breaks. But still, Alex Lifeson was the guy. He had this huge guitar sound. And it's clear in the first two albums that Lee and Rutsey in the first album and Lee and Peart in the second album, in Fly By Night, they were really struggling to stay with Lifeson. Lifeson was a huge guitar player, an extraordinary guitar player. But they weren't doing anything particularly original. Like I said, it was just Canadian Zeppelin, Canadian Cream, nothing that special. Then again, these are young kids. This is 1975 when they released Fly By Night, February of 75. They are, 22 and 23? Actually, not quite 22. They're 21 and 22 still. See, they're babies. They're just starting out. It's the next album, Caress of Steel, which was released in 1975. That's the breakthrough. That's the break. That's where Rush really started. This is the phase of what I'd call progressive metal between 1975 and 1979. See, they were a heavy metal band. They were playing blues, but blues that they weren't accessing directly. They were accessing it via Cream and Zeppelin, okay? 2 steps removed. But with Caress of Steel, what they started to integrate was basically progressive music. Bands like Genesis, like Yes, King Crimson. Bands that were basically very serious musicians who were drifting away from jazz or didn't really want to be playing jazz, but liked the complexity of jazz. Rush was integrating this progressive music into heavy metal. And Rush, in a very real sense, created this progressive metal, this music that was intricately arranged with constantly shifting time signatures. Very complex music, but heavy, really heavy, with a big, loud guitar, a big, loud drum, and a bass player who was really holding down the bottom. Because you listen to a lot of progressive bands, and they seem tinny. And their drum, especially, seems very tinny and tenuous. I mean, even though in 1970s there were no drum machines, they oddly sound like drum machines, like these very tinny little drum players. They weren't big, but Peart was a big drummer, and Lifeson was a huge guitar player. And so Caress of Steel, which came out in 75, in late 75, right there is the beginning of Rush. That's the first true Rush album. because they understood that what they were really doing was integrating this progressive music and filtering it through their own much heavier sensibility and creating this very heavy yet extraordinarily complex sound. And that's where they started with Caress of Steel. And the thing is, Caress of Steel was a flop. It was a disaster of an album. It was an album that sold fewer than Fly By Night, fewer units, and they were under a lot of pressure for the next album, for what was to become 2112. And their record label wanted them to do something more accessible. They wanted them to be more like Steely Dan. Steely Dan was a then popular band that's fallen into obscurity. The label wanted Rush to toe the corporate line. They were kind of outraged because Caress of Steel, if you look at the album, it's a big old mess. Yeah, it is. Because it starts with like 3 songs in a row that are, heavy metal songs, but weird. The first one is Bastille Day, then I Think I'm Going Bald, and then Lakeside Park. And they're like, what the hell is this? Complicated arrangements, changing time signatures. You can't really rock to these songs. Like Fly By Night, like Anthem in the previous album, in Fly By Night album, you could rock to them. Fly By Night is almost a pop song, yeah? Anthem was a song that you could rock to, but you couldn't rock to Bastille Day. You couldn't rock to Lakeside Park. And I Think I'm Going Bald was just weird, And then it has this long song called The Necromancer, divided into 3 subsections. And it's this weird atmospheric piece that goes on for, I believe, 12 minutes or something like that. And on side B, they have The Fountains of Lamneth, which is a song cycle about a young man from his birth until the moment of his maturity. And he goes through a first love. He goes through a period of being an alcoholic. It's this weird song cycle where clearly Rush are heavily influenced by Genesis and Yes, not to say stealing from Genesis and Yes. I mean, there's some riffs here and there that you're like, yeah, they kind of ripped that off now, didn't they? Yeah, they did. But, it was just weird and interesting and a complete mess, a complete disaster. Caress of Steel is a fucking disaster of an album. And yet that's the beginning of Rush. That's when they were understanding that what they could do is bring in this really complex music that they admired and put it through their own much heavier sensibility, their heavy metal sensibility, and turn it into something unique, something fresh and new and interesting and complex, something that you could listen to, something that you could bang your head to, something that you could study even. Because, I mean, The Necromancer, for instance, it's wild. It's kind of crazy. It's a song that you can drop acid to and you're going to have an awesome trip, or it's a song that you can listen to it stone cold sober and feel chills by the eeriness of the music. And at the same time, listen to it and get some thoughts and ideas out of it. Yeah? Although near the end, it kind of like falls apart, but that's not the point. The point is that they were doing music that worked on multiple levels. You listen to a Kiss song. I'm not putting Kiss down. I love Kiss, right? But they're pretty straightforward. They're just a party band. It's music you listen to when you're at a party and when you're talking to some girl that you want to fuck. That's the kind of band that Kiss is, yeah? And, they don't have a thought in their empty little heads. Not a one little thought. But Rush is a band that makes you think, and it's operating on multiple levels of complexity, like all the greatest music, okay? I mean, like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds is a great song because it's operating on multiple levels. It can achieve different results under different circumstances. That's why it's a great song, okay? And Rush was doing that with Caress of Steel. They were like riders on a horse that hasn't been broken, but and they're barely holding on, but they're still holding on, and they know that this is the ride that they want to be on, okay? Now, the next album, 2112, that's the first masterpiece that they made. And it's very clever from a production and political side, political in the sense of their business at the time. See, they were under enormous pressure to basically go back from what they'd done in Caress of Steel and go back to Fly By Night, which had several songs that could have been potentially pop hits. In fact, Fly By Night is extremely interesting because the band goes through a whole bunch of different styles. There's like a song, like a gentle little ballad called Rivendell. There's like a pop song, Fly By Night. Fly By Night was actually used in a car commercial, Volkswagen commercial. They got this heavy metal rocker anthem. They got the long song with Bytor and the Snow Dog. They got a lot of different songs there. They even have a song, Making Memories, that's kind of like country-esque almost. Not kidding. Check it out. They've got all kinds of different music on Fly By Night, of like experimenting. Caress of Steel, it's more progressive, using progressive music and to create progressive metal. The record label wanted them to go back to Fly By Night. They wanted singles. They wanted hit songs. And so 2112 is pretty interesting because on the one hand, on side one, you've got 2112 Suite, right? Which is the 7 or 8 part song cycle, 2112. It's a 20-minute song, I think it is total. I forget, but it's it's this opus. It's got an overture and it's got a grand finale. I mean, it's an opus. But on side two, they've got a bunch of singles. They got Passage to Bangkok, which is a song about smoking weed. They got The Twilight Zone. They got Tears, which is a ballad. Not kidding. Kind of crummy ballad, but 70s. And even with the drumming and the weird synths that they put in, it sounds like a 70s ballad. I think that probably retrospectively, Rush is a bit embarrassed by it, but it was a necessary song because it got the label off their back. Because they could say, look, we did the whole second side with singles. And they did, The last song is called You Don't Get Something for Nothing, which is, I think, very indicative because it's basically saying that, you can't get freedom for free. And in 2112, they did one half of the album their way. And the second half of the album, the studio's way. They did the singles. And the singles were pretty good, okay? I mean, all those songs, Passage to Bangkok, not Tears, Lessons, and Something for Nothing, and Twilight Zone, they were all like fan favorites, right? They never really hit it on the airwaves, but they were fan favorites. But 2112, that was the masterpiece. That was it. That was the thing. And what happened with the album 2112 is that it was released with little fanfare. The label was not happy with them. It was put out, and they went out to tour it, to support it. And what happened was that people started talking about it. They'd talk about it in middle school hallways. I mean, I remember, growing up in middle school and suburban public schools in the United States, and I'd hear about Rush. And it wasn't like the music that the radios were playing or that the popular press was talking about. Rush was the band that guys in middle school would pass around. And I played in band. Yes, I played the baritone in band. Fuck you. And in band, people would talk about Rush. And guys, the drummer, I remember, would play Neil Peart riffs. Yeah. And there was this other trombone player, baritone player. He was really good. I forget the kid's name. I can remember him very clearly. He was a year older than me. And on trombone one time, just fooling around, he started doing Passage to Bangkok. Yeah. I mean, 2112 started getting passed around. And through word of mouth, it slowly started gaining speed. It became a gold album, their first gold album. And pretty soon, it bought them their freedom. And that line from Something for Nothing is very true. You don't get freedom for free. They didn't get freedom for free. They decided very coldly and calculatedly, if you ask me, that they were going to do half for the label and half for themselves and see which would work. In a very real sense, they were sort of like flipping a coin. And they figure, we're going to do our way, but we're not going to burn our bridges. we're going to do our way for side one. And for side two, we're going to give them what they want. I mean, like the song Tears. I mean, that is a blatant grab for radio airplay. It's a ballad. I mean, the drumming doesn't even sound like Peart. It sounds like some studio drummer from the 1970s, you know? Somebody who might have played on the Bee Gees or the Carpenters, for crying out loud. I'm not kidding. You know, listen to the song. It's like, it's, you think it's embarrassing, but then you realize as a musician how hard it must have been to play that goddamn song, you know, to make it sound like a song that would get radio airplay. Didn't get radio airplay. I mean, 2112 eventually did get radio airplay, insanely as that might sound. But the point, 2112 bought them their freedom. And after that, after the success of 2112, which is slow building and built by word of mouth, but after that, the label could never tell them what to do. And the labels never did, okay? They would just do their own music. And this was reflected in the next album, A Farewell to Kings. A Farewell to Kings is, I think, in many ways superior to 2112. 2112 is spectacular, and there's no question about it. The song 2112 is unbelievable. But in a weird way, A Farewell to Kings pushes Rush even further. Because, you know, we have far more complex arrangements, okay? And sometimes it's a little bit overwhelming. But on Farewell to Kings, they're reaching that balance of almost, you know, limitless arrangement possibilities. And the album has just a few songs, but they are doozies. They've got the eponymous song, A Farewell to Kings, on side one, first song. Then they have Xanadu. Now, Xanadu is I remember listening to this shit when I was like 13 years old, and I was like, where does this come from? And I started like looking into this whole thing, and I discovered Samuel Coleridge Taylor, who had written the poem Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan was a poem. It's 50 lines that he wrote but never completed. It's not a finished poem. And it starts in Xanadu did Kublai Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. That's the opening of Kublai Khan, a great poem, one of the greatest poems in the English language. And the song Xanadu is essentially trying to complete that poem. And on top of that, it has this unbelievable music. I mean, holy cow. I mean, Lifeson is on fire, right? And here's what's really interesting, too, is that, see, in 2112, they'd had a few synthesizers. In fact, the opening of the 2112 suite has this long synthesizer passage, right? But it wasn't played by Rush. It was actually played by Hugh Simey, who was their art director, as a matter of fact. And he would play occasional keyboards over the years here and there, and just little bits here and there. Nothing major, and he never co-wrote anything. But in A Farewell to Kings, that's when Geddy Lee really started integrating keyboards into the Rush sound. And I would say that Xanadu is one of the most extraordinary moments where you have heavy metal, you know, unabashed heavy metal, real fucking heavy metal, right? Integrating keyboards in a way that is organic, that fits. Nine Inch Nails has said that a subsequent album of Rush's, Signals, that came out in 1982, and I'll discuss in a moment, that for Trent Reznor was like a big eye-opener. But to tell you the truth, I think that Xanadu is a bigger eye-opener than Signals. Because in Xanadu, Geddy Lee has this incredible synthesizer line that just floats and glides over the guitar and the drums and bass pedal synthesizers, right? And they start using bass pedal synthesizers, which would become a big thing in just a little bit. But the point, in Xanadu, that song really integrates synthesizers with heavy metal. And how can I put it? Squaring that circle had been something that a lot of different bands had tried to do and failed to do. And there were some bands that went out of their way to say how much they hated synthesizers. But Rush, rather than fight synthesizers, they tried to bring it in, to understand the synthesizer and use it to their advantage, to emphasize the heaviness of their music. And they succeeded brilliantly in Xanadu. And the subsequent songs in Farewell to Kings, right? There was the standout really is Cygnus X1, Book One, because of course there'd be a book two, yeah. Because Rush is never a band that would leave its audience hanging. No, if they decided that they were going to do a book one, you knew as a fan that the next album there's going to be a book two. Fuck it. In later albums, they did a Fear trilogy. They spread out these 3 songs for the Fear trilogy over 3 consecutive albums. Yeah, in reverse order. And I'll get to that in a moment. But like, dude, these guys, man, they delivered, right? But the real standout of this period of progressive metal, the high point of it, and a song and an album rather, that in many ways I think is a masterpiece of progressive music, outshining just about anything else. Even incredible progressive bands like Pink Floyd or Jethro Tull or Genesis, and yes, Hemispheres. Hemispheres was a standout album because once again the first side was a song suite, and it was Cygnus X1 Book 2, Hemispheres, right? There's a continuation from A Farewell to Kings. I mean, they're so goddamn dorky, right? But the lyrics are extraordinary because in 2112, they had assembled this song suite, and the lyrics made complete sense. They were about a man who discovered a guitar, and he was living in this future society in the year 2112. And in this future society was controlled by the priests of the temples of Syrinx. And these priests would control the lives of everyone. And this individual, this unnamed narrator, he comes across this guitar and he learns to play it. And he thinks that it's wonderful music. And he takes it to the temples of Syrinx to show it to the priests. And the priests of the temples of Syrinx, they destroy the guitar and they basically declare him outcast because they say that their society does not need this music. And so the narrator, in despair, he wanders off and has a vision. He has a vision of the elder race of man. And this elder race of man has left the earth and they've gone far away, but they're going to return. The unnamed narrator from this vision believes that hope is lost and the elder race of man will never return. And so he decides to commit suicide. And that's the end of 2112 until you get to the grand finale of 2112. The unnamed narrator kills himself in the soliloquy, which is the penultimate part of the suite. And in 2112, the grand finale, the last ominous words are, attention all planets of the Solar Federation, we have assumed control. The elder race of man have returned, and they've destroyed the temples of Syrinx and the priests within it, but it's left hanging as to whether this elder race of man might be in fact worse than the priests of the temples of Syrinx. It's a bleak vision. It's very subtle, But Hemispheres is even better. It basically posits that there's the god of there's the god of the mind and the god of the heart. Apollo is the god of the mind, and Dionysus is the god of the heart. And they both promise people a wondrous life, but a very different kind of life. And when the people follow each of these gods, they inevitably become dissatisfied. Even though they're thrilled by the things that the gods are giving them, they become dissatisfied. And the new god emerges, who is a character in the Cygnus X1 from Farewell to Kings, and he becomes Cygnus, the god of balance. And it ends this suite of songs in a very haunting and very beautiful little ballad, acoustic guitar ballad, that's just lovely. And it really just works. It's a very complex song cycle, and it just works really well. But the only thing I could say, and very typical of progressive music, is that in a lot of parts in Hemispheres, it's a little overindulgent, self-indulgent. But the thing about Rush is that they always had humor about themselves. And they were aware of this because on side two of the Hemispheres album, they have the granddaddy of all rock instrumental songs, La Villa Strangiato. La Villa Strangiato is based on a dream that Alex Lifeson had. And he had this dream that was sort of like a dream nightmare. And he wrote it down and he used it as the basis for this 9-minute instrumental that goes through everything. It uses classical Spanish guitar, it uses mood music, I mean, stuff that would be properly written by Brian Eno. It uses cartoon music. It's like heavy metal cartoon music. Come on, what the fuck is that all about, right? But it does it. It does it beautifully. And it also, side two of Hemisphere's album, throws in a couple of really, two standout songs, Circumstances and The Trees, right? But in that album, you see several things happening simultaneously. On the one hand, you see Lifeson is reaching for greatness as a guitar player. I mean, he's really pushing the envelope. The first long guitar solo in La Villa Strangiato, which builds up from this very, very soft and gentle beginning into this incredible shredding, but it's shredding, yeah, but there's so much feel to it. Much as I love Buckethead, for instance, when he shreds, there's like, it's almost robotic, which might actually be the point with Buckethead. But when Lifeson shreds in La Villa Strangiato, there's feel. It's all minor notes. It's all like this feeling of sadness. You know, it's a remarkable guitar solo. I mean, it really is one of the most beautiful guitar solos you'll ever hear. And anyway, the point is that Lifeson is reaching for greatness as a guitar player, and he's hitting it consistently. I mean, even though the work that he did on 2112 is just astronomical. I mean, the guitar solo in the grand finale has to be just like, holy cow, it's just, you know, intergalactically unbelievable, right? But the guitar in Hemispheres is just reaching for greatness. And you can feel it. You can feel how he, as a guitarist, knows that he's reaching for greatness, that he's trying to play shit that has never been played before and never been played as well, okay? And he's achieving it. And he's using 12-string electric guitars, 6-string guitars, acoustic and electric, Spanish classical guitar. I mean, he's doing it all. He's just throwing it all out there. He's putting it all on the line. La Villa Strangiato is, I think, one of the pinnacles of Alex Lifeson's guitar playing. As a guitar player myself, well, a very bad one, I'll have you know, I can say, you know, that some of the stuff that's on Hemispheres is like untouchable. And there are a lot of other guitar players who thought the same. Eddie Van Halen, one of the greatest rock guitar players ever, you know, in some songs, he outright rips off Rush. Like, for instance, The Pleasure Dome off their album For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge. That's a straight-up rip-off of Xanadu, yeah? Yeah, and an homage, rip-off, call it what you will. I mean, yeah, and in what you call it, in Hemispheres, in La Villa Strangiato, the last song, this monster instrumental, holy cow. But at the same time, see, Peart is also breaking through on this album. Because this album, they pushed themselves, all three of them actually, and I'll get to Lee in just a second. But they were pushing themselves so hard, and you could see it. They were pushing themselves to as far as they could go as musicians. Because where Lifeson is just doing things like with all of the guitars that he has at his disposal, right? And doing things tonally and technically that are amazing. Well, Peart all of a sudden discovered the ride cymbal. And he discovered it in a way of how he could start making patterns on his ride cymbal. Because before, traditionally, you had a ride cymbal and it would just be doing 16th notes, right? But Peart started using in Hemispheres the ride cymbal to create mini shapes within the overall shape of his drumming. Because, you know, when a drummer is drumming, you know, he creates shapes. Like let me give you a very simple example. Doom top top, doom top top, doom top top, doom top top. You know, that's a waltz. That's 3/4 time, right? And that's a very simple pattern. Now, you have more complex patterns that naturally emerge from, like, for instance, progressive music or just more sophisticated music, quite frankly. And you have these patterns, but what happens a lot of times in drumming is that you will have the drummer use either the ride cymbal or the hi-hat to basically mark time, mark straight inflexible time, usually 16th or 32nd notes, going. And so that way, with his other instruments, he's doing other stuff. And it would be like, I'm not coordinated enough right now to be able to do it, but take my word for it. He'll be doing, a normal drummer, will be hitting the hi-hat on 8th notes or 16th notes or rarely 32nd notes, right? And his other limbs are doing other things. They're forming the pattern, the shape of what he's drumming. But Peart realized that he could get to a point of limb independence, which is extraordinarily difficult to achieve, where he could have his hand, his right hand, on the ride cymbal, hitting a pattern that is totally different from the pattern that his 2 feet and his left arm are doing. And all of a sudden, it's just a brand new kind of drumming. Very subtle, but it becomes like it becomes of bigger and bigger importance as Rush continues. Because up to this point, Neil Peart, as a drummer, he's just a really, really big drummer. He hits it really fucking hard. Okay, he's basically, John Bonham's long lost kid, his Canadian kid, if you will, right? He just hits it really hard. I mean, he's like Keith Moon, John Bonham, hitting the drum really hard, and doing these big rototom fills, like down the toms or up the toms, as it were, sometimes, right? But in hemispheres, he starts understanding the drums because he's pushing himself so hard. And so is Lee. Lee, as a bass player, he's always been a very good bass player. He'd always been a little bit frisky. Okay, he was never content, like, for instance, like a guy like John Entwistle of The Who, who'd like play the same, 16th notes and be happy with it. Lee just couldn't stand for that kind of shit. Because John Entwistle, yeah, sure, he could play complicated figures and whatnot, but when a song demanded him to play the whole thing in 16th notes for the whole, 4 minutes of it, he'd do it, Lee couldn't. He can't sit still as a bass player. And he would just throw in little licks, little cool little bits into his playing. But it's in hemispheres that he started adding funk. There's a weird funkiness to his playing that is really noticeable in La Via Strangiato. Because La Via Strangiato, periodically, though it's guitar dominated, and it's really owned by Leifson, Leifson periodically just stops playing guitar, just abruptly stops, and creates the space for either the drums or the bass to just solo for a few seconds. And Lee and Peart took full advantage of this, okay? And they added these incredible fills, but though Peart's fills in La Via Strangiato are fantastic, it's more of the same stuff that he'd done in previous albums. But Lee was doing new shit, like funky shit with his bass playing, doing stuff that he hadn't been doing before. And other bass players had been doing, especially progressive bass players, especially guys like Chris Squire of Yes. His famous bass solo, The Fish. Yeah, I've been doing that shit for ages, right? But Geddy Lee is doing it. And he's doing it really well, and it sounds like Geddy Lee. I mean, he's clearly influenced by what was going on with Chris Squire, and to a lesser extent, the bassist for Cream. What's his face? His name is slipping my mind, but you guys know who I'm talking about. The singer and bassist. But what you call it? Lee has his own style, his own sound. Okay, and there's this weird funkiness that he's adding. It's a funkiness that's he's adding to his sound in Hemispheres. Hemispheres, as an album, is the pinnacle of progressive metal. It's the song cycle itself is impeccable. It's better than, I mean, conceptually better and more complete than just about any progressive album out there. I mean, if you're going to talk to me about Pink Floyd, I mean, come on, fuck off. The Wall is incoherent. It doesn't make any sense. The end of The Wall does not make any sense logically compared to the rest of the album. I'm not saying that The Wall is a bad album. I'm saying it's incoherent. And Animals, oh man, Animals has a lot of really good shit, but the mix is a disaster. And again, it's intellectually incoherent. Okay? I mean, to tell you the truth, I don't think that Roger Waters has ever been able to make a internally coherent album. He always has these great bits, but they never all come together. It's never truly synergistic. The only time that it might have happened is in Dark Side of the Moon, but in Dark Side of the Moon, it was just thematic. It was not a story. It was not a narrative, which is what great progressive music is all about. It's about a narrative, okay? And that's kind of like the whole point of the fucking genre. You know what I'm saying? And so, he never quite pulled it off. He kind of sort of did it, Roger Waters, in The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking in 1984, right? But then he did Radio Chaos, which is just an abortion as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, the point is that, see, a lot of these progressive musicians, they would come out with these great bits, these great songs. I mean, like you listen to The Wall, and you got Another Brick in the Wall Part 2 and Part 3 to a lesser extent, and you've got Mother and Comfortably Numb, but the rest of it is kind of shit, and it's kind of shit, yeah. And you got Animals, where that the first part of Dogs is great, but and Pigs on the Wing, the first one is okay, but then Pigs on the Wing, the second one is just a repeat. It's nothing really new. It's not really doing anything. And Sheep is a fucking disaster, right? But anyway, Pigs is all right. I mean, the song Pigs, but Dogs, man, that's a disappointment. But anyway, the point: all of these progressive bands, they could never pull it all together, but Rush did on Hemispheres. They pulled it together. They made they brought it together. Mm-hmm. It's the only progressive album that's ever just really come together. It's like all of these cooks have been trying to make the perfect souffle that would rise, and only Rush pulled it off. You see? Some, it was like they partially made it. They almost made it, but they didn't really. Hemispheres is it. Hemispheres, I would argue, is probably the greatest progressive rock album ever. I'm not talking about progressive metal. I'm talking progressive rock, full stop. Genesis and all of these bands, okay? All of them. Hemispheres is kind of it, It can't be topped. Maybe it could be topped by Pink Floyd's album Metal. Maybe, okay? But it doesn't have the thematic clarity and perfect execution of Hemispheres, okay? Musically, Metal is really fantastic. But, in terms of just like bringing it all together and buttoning it up and having it all perfectly tidy, the perfect souffle, Hemispheres. It's untouchable in that regard, okay? Now, here we have to pause a little bit. See, in 1974, Rush had released the album Rush, which was, like I said, Canadian Zeppelin, a knockoff of other artists. Very well done, very, very energetic, but nothing really special. But 4 years later, they are releasing an album that, like I've said and argued, is probably the greatest progressive rock album ever. And if you don't think it's the best ever, you got to give me the fact that it's among the best ever, among that nebulous set of the greatest of all time, right? Hemispheres is definitely that. And it's coming off of having done Farewell to Kings and 2112. And 2112 is an indisputable masterpiece, okay? It's not quite as perfect as Hemispheres, but whatever it makes up in whatever imperfections it might have, it makes up for it in sheer drive and sheer energy. And I think, frankly, it's the energy of desperation, because when the boys were making 2112, they were about to be cut by their label, okay? And so there's that edge of desperation in 2112, and you can hear it. And that adds an energy to it that nothing comes close to. And Hemispheres does not have that because there they are in full control of their career. And this is how you know they were in full control of their career, because they did Hemispheres, and here they pivoted. They pivoted huge. They pivoted in a way that could never have been guessed, because you could have guessed after Bytor and the Snow Dog that they'd eventually hit something like Hemispheres, right? The 4-year development between Rush in 1974 and Hemispheres in 78, that's incredible. It's an incredible musical development. The sound of the album, the writing of it, the lyrics, the music, the arrangements, everything. It's unbelievable. It's late years, right? But here they took an even bigger step forward. It was unbelievable. This is the moment when they started what I'd call post-punk progressive. See, Rush always despised the punk scene. They always looked down on punk musicians because they said, correctly, that punk rockers don't know how to play their instruments. And that's very true, okay? The punk scene is all about the scene, not about being good musicians and writing good songs. That's not what punk is about. Punk is an aesthetic. Punk, I could argue, is actually more like a socio-political movement rather than a musical movement, right? But post-punk, well, those are basically punksters who started to learn how to actually play their fucking instruments, right? People like Talking Heads and the B-52s. Those bands that started punk but actually started to learn to become musicians and became fairly decent musicians and sometimes great musicians, right? They had this energy to them. They used the energy of punk, but they channeled it through acceptable musicianship, okay? See, post-punk is heavy metal plus what I'm calling post-punk progressive, which is what this stage of Rush's career became, starting with the album Permanent Waves. It's basically heavy metal plus progressive arrangements, but influenced by post-punk bands like The Police, Ultravox, and Talking Heads. And by the way, all those bands, The Police, Ultravox, Talking Heads, B-52s, they were the precursors for New Wave, which would hit Rush later on. But see, Rush, that's what they started admiring, these post-punk bands' energy. And they integrated that energy by creating the albums Permanent Waves, Moving Pictures, and Signals. Those 3 albums, in 1980, 81, and 82, those were post-punk progressive albums. They had that post-punk energy, but they had the musical sophistication of progressive and bathed in this heavy metal sound. And here you have a Rush that is a lot more relaxed, because Hemispheres, brilliant though it is, it's an extremely structured album. It's thought through. Everything is torqued down insofar as spontaneity. It's not spontaneous. It's not supposed to be spontaneous. It's supposed to be extremely structured, extremely well thought out. And they turned away from that. Permanent Waves is a lot more relaxed, just a lot more fun, because Hemispheres is serious music, but Permanent Waves is fun. It's just a joy to listen to it. From the very first riff, which is basically Alex Lifeson ripping off the sequencer from The Who's Baba O'Reilly. But of course, Pete Townsend got that sequencing by some playing with the tape and a computer, right? Lifeson did it just with his fingers on a guitar, okay? Yeah, it's kind of like untouchable because it's a really hard riff to learn. I mean, dude, believe me, it's really fucking hard to learn that goddamn riff, right? And Lifeson pulls it off effortlessly. It's like nothing. And the weird thing, by the way, Permanent Waves is chock full of triplets. I mean, it's all over the goddamn place. What the fuck? I have no idea what happened, but it was like in that album in particular, they just drunk like from a giant well of triplets, because there are triplets all over the place. But okay, that's not even really important for this conversation. The point I want to make really is that Permanent Waves was that first moment when they kind of like were fully into their own. They were fully confident. Because even though Hemispheres, there is a clear sense of confidence as to what they were doing, of like knowing exactly where they're going, there was still like tension. Tension in the sense of almost being unsure. Mhm. They knew where they were going, but they were like a little nervous still. But in permanent waves, there's a sense that, they not only know where they're going, but they can handle whatever comes their way so they're not worried. And that kind of confidence comes through in the music. And it's no wonder that Permanent Waves was a huge seller. Okay, it went platinum. And it had a bunch of songs that are still played. It had basically 6 songs. And it was actually their shortest album ever. It only clocked in at 30 minutes. It had, Spirit of Radio, Free Will, Jacob's Ladder, Entre Nous, Different Strings, and Natural Sciences. Natural Sciences, I think, also is a masterpiece. It's one of the most incredible songs ever. It just covers it all, because Rush would have this habit of sometimes doing these big monster songs that would sort of like go all over the place and just do everything. And Natural Science is one of those. It just does everything. Yeah. But anyway, the point of Permanent Waves that you have to emphasize is that, see, in Permanent Waves, the songs are shorter, apart from Natural Sciences, of course, and they're simpler. They're not so highly and tightly structured as the songs in Hemispheres. You get a sense, too, that live, these songs can be improvised upon, as they would, many times in different, recordings of concerts that they have given over the years, over the decades. You can hear the different members of Rush just improvising, just doing new things with each of these songs. Their live sets have always been very structured. They tend to repeat, or let me phrase that, they always repeat the songs that they're doing. They don't like show up live and play something completely different. It's not the Grateful Dead. Rush has never been that kind of a band. Rush has always been a band that delivers the songs that they recorded. They always look at their recording as the best version of their song, and they always look at their live performances as trying to replicate them, replicate those best performances. They have the notion that there is an ideal. They're not like a lot of other musicians, for instance, jazz musicians, who think that, you should be totally spontaneous and just allow whatever happens to happen. And if you want to improvise and go in different directions, you should. They just don't have that approach. I used to think that one approach was better than the other. When I was younger, I thought that Rush's approach was better. When I was like a teenager, my early 20s, I always thought, yeah, you have the album song and then you should try to repeat it. And then when I was in my late 20s and into my 30s, I thought, no, that's boring. You should have the album and then just play off of it. Because actually, I went to some Rush concerts and I was kind of bored with the Rush concerts because they were playing the songs as I'd heard them, and I would have much preferred at that time to have listened to them play it differently, more not merely spontaneously, but just go off in a different direction. But then, as an older man, I'm realizing that it's just simply different approaches. And they both have their pros and cons. I mean, you listen to the Grateful Dead, and sometimes their performances are fantastic, but more often than not, they're a fucking train wreck. Come on. Some of these jams are endless and they're boring as fuck. Yeah? And because they don't know where they're going, they're just noodling along, Sometimes, sure, you've got a great recording from the Grateful Dead, but other times, most of the times, I'd argue, at least 3/4 of the time, the bootlegs of the Grateful Dead are boring as fuck. I mean, they're just a step above elevator music, you know what I'm saying? And so you got to keep in mind that kind of complete freedom and improvisation, it works rarely. I mean, even jazz musicians, they often repeat bits and they claim that they're being spontaneous, but you listen to, songs on a particular tour, on consecutive nights, and you realize that they're basically playing the same shit. They just came up with a new arrangement for that particular tour, different from the recording. But they're sticking to that arrangement because they know that if they really improvise, sometimes they're just not feeling it and they're going to fall flat on their face and it's going to be fucking embarrassing. Yeah, that happens all the time. Yeah. And so as an older man, I see the point of both approaches. Okay. And I no longer begrudge Rush about it. But anyway, going back to Permanent Waves and this post-punk progressive period that they embarked in. See, what's fascinating about this period is that I guess what I said before is the key issue. They were confident and they weren't afraid of anything coming their way because they had the sense that they could handle anything that would come their way. And they did. Permanent Waves was a huge hit, and it was followed by an even bigger hit, Moving Pictures. Moving Pictures' first song is Tom Sawyer, the most famous Rush song ever, right? And in many ways, Tom Sawyer encapsulates everything good about Rush in this period. It's incredibly energetic, incredibly complex. It uses heavy metal guitars, heavy drumming, and perfectly placed synthesizers and brings them all together just perfectly. In a very real sense, Tom Sawyer is like the distillation of Xanadu that had appeared in A Farewell to Kings. It has all of the elements of Xanadu. Incredibly complex drumming and complex drum shapes, incredibly complex guitar playing, blistering solos, of course, and the bass playing that really holds down the bottom, but it's not merely supporting the drums and the guitar, but the bass is really going into its own insofar as laying down a melody line, which you can feel much more in Permanent Waves and Moving Pictures, where the bass is doing a lot of heavy lifting insofar as carrying the melody line. And it's really remarkable, Geddy Lee's growth as bass player, because yeah, sure, in previous songs, in different songs in the past, he'd been following along the melody line, but it was more like in support, and he wasn't alone. It was like the guitar and the bass were doing melody lines, much like punk, right? But here in Permanent Waves, and especially Moving Pictures, you have the bass really picking out a melody, while the guitar rather, is just drenching it in feedback. You hear this in the chorus of Tom Sawyer's, in the song, in the part, what you say about his company is what you say about society. You listen to that bit, and you can hear the guitar is just drenching it with feedback, heavy metal feedback, but not really doing anything melody wise. It's the bass that's providing the melody line, really marking it, bringing it along, right? They did something similar in the first two songs on Permanent Waves, on Spirit of Radio and Free Will, where the bass is really holding up the melody line in a way that traditionally had been done by the guitar, It's really interesting. Yeah. And so anyway, Moving Pictures, it's got a lot of standout hits, a lot of standout songs. The first side is Tom Sawyer, Red Barchetta, or Red Barchetta. I've never known how to pronounce it, to tell you the truth. And then you got YYZ, that's the instrumental, and Limelight. Limelight it's a beautiful song. It's a heartbreaking song. And it's a really prescient song. Because see, Moving Pictures would wind up selling something like 4 million copies. It became the album of that year. And I remember it very clearly. It was the year I was 13 years old. And everybody was listening to that album. Everybody went to the concert. I was living in Miami at the time. I was getting into dope in a big way, and other drugs and whatnot. And yeah, Rush was the band. That was the band. And the funny thing is that Limelight, the song, is about fame. And it's about how fame alienates so badly. And it's really a fascinating song. It's a fascinating window into Neil Peart's personality. He's got the most famous line in that song, which is, "I can't pretend a stranger is a long-awaited friend." Now, here's the thing about Neil Peart's lyrics. Not merely up to this point, but throughout the career of Rush. He wrote the vast majority of the lyrics. I'd say like 95% of the lyrics. And Geddy Lee himself was explained why. Because when he joined the band, when Peart joined the band, Lee and Lifeson didn't really feel like writing lyrics, right? But they looked at Peart, and Peart used words that they'd never heard of. He read a lot, and they figured, man, this fucker might know how to write fucking lyrics. And that's how he got the gig, because the other two just didn't want to write lyrics, And so Peart approached it like the way he approached everything, which is very systematically, very patiently, and he wrote lyrics in a very structured way. And because of it, his songs, they didn't deal with ambiguity. He wasn't one who really liked ambiguity. He liked to nail shit down. And so when he would talk about something, he would nail it down. And you could see it, like, for instance, in Hemispheres and 2112, these very long song cycles, or suites, or call them what you will, where it's a very complex narrative, and he nails it down. He nails it really down all the way to the end, and its conclusion. There's no incoherence like you had in the other bands that I mentioned before, and the other albums I mentioned before by other bands like Pink Floyd and whatnot. So because of that, a lot of critics didn't like it because they said that he's too on the nose. Okay, fine, but what happened is that, see, Peart, by being so quote unquote on the nose, he would articulate things that nobody else was articulating, that a lot of people might be feeling and might be trying to address in a very roundabout way. But he would nail it right on the head. I mean, just nail it right the fuck down. Boom, bang. He's got a song that came out in a later album, in in the Presto album in 1989, called "The Pass," and it's flat out about suicide, and it's a really tough song to listen to. And it's basically the narrator of the song just shitting on a guy who committed suicide, who is going to commit suicide, and saying, Christ, what have you done? Okay? And saying, all of us get lost in the darkness. All of us do time in the gutter. All of us have misery in our lives. But that's no excuse to give up on life. Because giving up on life, you will regret it, of course, but you'll be gone. And that's what he's saying in that song, in The Pass. And he nails it down. The Pass is a song that you should play for anybody who's considering suicide. Because that song, it doesn't like float around or wander around the topic. No, it goes straight ahead. And that's one of the things that Peart had that as an older man, I appreciate. Because when I was very young, when I was a teenager, I loved the fact that he was so concrete and to the point and nailing it down tight. And in my late 20s, into my 30s, and even into my early 40s, I sort of like drifted away from that directness, that on the noseness. But as I became a 40-something-year-old and now a 50-something-year-old man, I appreciate it. I realize how easy it is to be ambiguous, how easy it is to circle around a topic but not confront it, not nail it down. And the fact that Peart in his lyrics would nail down shit, nail it down tight. I mean, like really just hammer it, okay? Especially the important subjects. There are songs like about suicide, like The Pass. There's songs about time and how time passes and it's gone, and how regretful we are, like Time Stands Still or Headlong Flight. There are other songs in their repertoire about free will, like, for instance, the song Free Will. And the song that started this discussion, Limelight, which is about how fame distorts a life and how fame can make you miserable. Mm-hmm. I mean, he nails shit down. And you see, I'm coming to the conclusion, and I'm realizing this as I'm doing this this broadcast, that when I was very young, I needed somebody to nail down the topics and nail them down tight and tell me exactly what was going on. And then as I got older, I was like, oh, that's so childish and so easy, I thought naively, to be so precise, and that I appreciated more ambiguity. But as I get older, I'm realizing how truly hard it is to nail a topic right on the head, hit it right square between the eyes, how hard it is, and how necessary it is. And also, I realized that in a lot of ways, when you're in your 20s and 30s, you want things to be more ambiguous because your own life is a little bit ambiguous as to where you're going, ambiguous as to who you are, and that nailing down of things, of hitting it right on the nose, is a little unnerving at that age because you yourself are a little bit vague. as it were. And you don't want things to be so crystal clear. And so Neil Peart has this crystal clarity about his lyrics that appeals very much to very young people, to young teenagers and guys in their early 20s, especially guys, because he's telling them how things are. And it's something that appeals to an older man, such as myself, and such as older men that I know of, who have oddly circled back to Rush as old men. And they tell me, yeah, one of the things that they really appreciate is the fact that he's talking about shit directly, squarely, not vaguely, not ambiguously, not with metaphor. Fuck that. Right between the eyes. And it's that middle age, that age in your late 20s and 30s and into your early 40s, that you want that vagueness because you don't want to be nailed down. You see? Yeah, that's only something now that I'm realizing as I'm discussing this with you guys. But anyway, going back to the Moving Pictures album, the second half of it has this long song called The Camera Eye, which I personally have never particularly cared for. I like it. It's exciting. It's a fun song. It is kind of like a ripoff of The Song Remains the Same by Led Zeppelin, which came out roughly around that same time, a little bit earlier than Moving Pictures. And perhaps it was like some sort of like homage because John Bonham had recently died. I don't know. But Rush has had the habit of periodically ripping off riffs of other artists. I mean, blatantly ripping them off, right? In The Fountain of Lamneth, the riff of the main riff of the opening of The Fountain of Lamneth is ripped off from some Genesis song, right? And in The Camera Eye, it rips off this guitar drum interplay from The Song Remains the Same. The aforementioned Spirit of Radio riff is ripping off Baba O'Reilly from The Who. And so I'm not sure if they're ripping them off or it's homage, because they're not like ripping off some really obscure band that nobody's ever heard of. No, they're ripping off like very well-known bands that had sold millions of copies, bands that had sold more than them. And so I don't quite know, but they've never apologized for it. And their catalog is so rich with very clearly original material. Okay, I mean, these ripoffs, we're talking over 19 original albums. I would say maybe 5 or 6 snippets that kind of like sound like somebody else. Okay, so I'm not sure if it's a sin that we're really going to be like pressing charges over. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, they kind of like do that once in a while. It's kind of funny. But anyway, the next album is really interesting in a number of ways. Signals is the first stage where they really brought in synthesizers. They were clearly influenced by Ultravox, which was one of these post-punk / incipient new wave bands. And Signals has, this is pretty much the pinnacle of Alex Lifeson as a guitar player. It's the album that he peaked as a guitar player, and what's interesting is that after this, he kind of got bored with it. As a guitar player, as an artist, he just kind of like got sick of playing guitar. And you can see that in the subsequent albums, which I'll discuss in a moment, Lifeson continued to be a very, very good guitar player. He just wasn't inspired anymore. I think that Signals was sort of like the end of Lifeson as this incredibly inspired guitar player. I think that, and the sense I get from his music, is that after Signals, starting with Grace Under Pressure, he viewed it as a job. And do keep in mind, by 1982, 83, Lifeson is 30 years old. He's got a couple of kids. He's married. He's got a life. Okay, he's got a life that he's got to support. He doesn't have any education. He doesn't have anything to fall back on. He enjoys being a musician, right? I mean, he likes it. He likes being a rock star. So he continues. He soldiers on. He's a professional musician, but he's not inspired anymore. And this, I have to say that it's a little bit sad, because the music that comes after this period, this post-punk progressive period of theirs, that starts with new wave metal, he's just not inspired. He's just not feeling it anymore. A lot of people say that, the great poets, they wrote all their great material before age 30. And you look at a lot of them, Pushkin, Keats, a bunch of others, and it's sort of true, you know. And it could be that, certain crafts or certain individuals, it could be, they really peak when they're young, and then after that, they soldier on, but they're just not, you know, really feeling it. Mhm. There is an inventiveness to Lifeson's guitar playing, like a joie de vivre that was incredible, right up to Signals. In Signals itself, on the song "The Weapon," it's got one of the creepiest, nastiest, most interesting guitar solos ever. Okay, it's just a nasty piece of work. It's really fucking cool, you know. I mean, it's just like, whoa, Nelly. You know what I'm saying? Really get great guitar playing. And but after that, you never see that kind of spark, you know, in Lifeson's playing. He plays great guitar solos, it's all just really good, really capable. I mean, in a really high level, okay? But it's not truly inspired. It's a little bit like, for instance, Eddie Van Halen. Eddie Van Halen, after 1984, it was just repeating himself. He never really came up with anything really, really new, you know? It was just like more of the same. His greatest album, Fair Warning, it was just chock full of extraordinary ideas. That was an inspired album, an inspired guitar album, right? And 1984, it basically created a pop metal, hair bands. The whole hair bands thing of the 80s, that was Van Halen, starting with 1984. They kicked that fucker off, that which ended with Appetite for Destruction, and then, Nirvana and their fucking whinging kind of pussy ass bitch music. But I'll get to that in some other broadcast. But the point, see, all artists kind of like peak. Mhm. And they usually peak when they're still surprised by their album and by their instrument, rather. They're surprised by their instrument and still surprised by their ability with it. They're surprised at what they can do. Okay? And Lifeson in Hemispheres had pushed himself to the very brink with La Via Strangiato. He really did. And he brought along the other two. Okay? And let's not kid ourselves. Peart and Lee, great musicians, but up to Signals, they weren't that out of the box. They became bigger, Lee and Peart, after. After Lifeson had sort of like, okay, It's not that he gave up, okay? It's just that he just wasn't as inspired. Mm-hmm. And perhaps that loss of inspiration by Lifeson, which is noticeable, it's subtle. It's really subtle because it's not that he's not pulling his weight. He is pulling his weight. And in some songs, lots of songs, he does really extraordinary work, but there's not that unrelenting drive, that unrelenting inspiration that had been apparent before Grace Under Pressure, the next stage, right? He was just a very, very capable, very proficient, very creative guitar player. But he was a professional and he was no longer inspired. And that's kind of sad. That really is rather sad. I have to say that it's a little bit of a downer to bring this period, the pinnacle of Rush in many ways, the post-punk progressive era of 1980 to 1983. That was an amazing period. And those three albums, Permanent Waves, Moving Pictures, and Signals, I mean, I'm going to be discussing in a little bit like the best albums and which are the albums you should get if you've never heard Rush, and what order you should listen to them and what songs you should listen. I'll do that in just a little bit. But the point I want to end here of this post-punk progressive period is that Lifeson peaked, okay? This is where he peaked. The technical brilliance of the progressive metal era that had peaked in Hemispheres, he applied that incredible technique and really expressed himself by way of the guitar. And so much of the music of these three albums, Permanent Waves, Moving Pictures, and Signals, is extraordinary because of Lifeson. He did extraordinary things, like, for instance, the guitar solo in Limelight. Quite possibly, I would argue, the most beautiful guitar solo ever recorded. I mean, it's breathtaking. It's heartbreaking. And it's a solo, it's a piece of music that could only exist with an electric guitar. It's a bit of music that only exists because of the instrument, okay? That could never be replicated by any other instrument in existence. It uses the guitar, the electric guitar, in a way that is extraordinary, and it's heartbreaking. I mean, it's really one of the saddest guitar solos ever. And then, on YYZ, there's so much program music. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that this is a period of time where they started doing a lot of program music. Well, they'd always done a lot of program music. Program music, for those of you who don't know, is music where the musicians, the music itself, tries to mimic something else, often like a natural thing, like I don't know, like, for instance, a river in what's this guy's name in Smetana's My Fatherland. Yeah, in the My Fatherland, the opening, what you call it, flute, is trying to mimic the flow of the Danube through through Budapest, right? And Rush did a lot of program music throughout their career, where they deliberately tried to mimic the sound of some event, right? But like they sort of like hit a peak of that, with Jacob's Ladder on Permanent Waves. Permanent Waves, Jacob's Ladder. It's basically about a storm, okay, and it's really just program music, from head to toe. And in moving pictures, they've got a lot of program music. In Signals, Signals not so much. That's where it's sort of like faded out, okay? But so much of Lifeson's guitar playing in these three albums is so inspired and so technically accomplished. It's really the pinnacle of his career. And then we have the next stage, which is new wave metal. A lot of Rush fans call this period of the time when they have heavy synthesizers, and they do it. They did. They had a lot of synthesizers, and partly I think it's because Lifeson had sort of like, he hadn't checked out, but he just taken a noticeable step back. He just wasn't as inspired. I think he basically defeated his instrument. He'd pushed it as far as he could go, and he was like, okay, where now? And there wasn't any place to go. See, I think that's what happened to him, because the subsequent albums here, okay, well, there are certain things going on here in this period. Here in this period of 1984 to 1988, all the songs are a lot shorter. They're more concise, okay? There's an almost overwhelming use of synthesizers that crowd out the guitar. I mean, and Lifeson, in this period, he is in a creative trough. He'd pull out of it later, okay? In the very late 80s and into the 90s, he'd pull out of this creative trough. And he made actually some pretty brilliant material, especially in Test for Echo, their weakest album overall, but with a lot of really interesting shit. But Lifeson was in a creative trough, and Lee sort of like filled in that trough with synthesizers. There's also another problem that, see, up to this point, Rush had been writing songs for vinyl records, for vinyl long-playing records. And those records were usually 45 minutes long or less, 22 minutes, 30 seconds per side. That was basically what you could put on a vinyl record. But on a CD, you could put up to 75 minutes of music. Uh-huh. And so because of that, they started to overwrite their albums. And essentially, they started putting a lot of filler into their albums. It's most noticeable in Hold Your Fire from 1987. Hold Your Fire was an album that was overwritten, overproduced, overcomplicated by synthesizers. It was, in a very real sense, a failure. It has a lot of standout points to it, a lot of interesting shit, but it was a failure, okay? Because what was going on here is that Rush were basically integrating new wave. They had become fascinated by new wave. You could tell they were into bands like Duran Duran, okay? The new wave bands were it, and they were dominating the scene, and it affected their sound. And their sound became thinner. The sound on their albums became a lot thinner. And that was coupled with Lifeson's creative trough, whereby as a guitar player, he's just not really feeling it. And so he wasn't like showing up big and muscular with elbows out and sticking them out and just planting himself there. It was more that he was sort of like dancing around and doing a lot of drop-ins, but he wasn't really front and center. And so the albums of this period, they were really good in many ways, and in many ways they were kind of weak. Okay? Now, Grace Under Pressure, for instance, when I listened to it the first time I listened to it, I bought it the day it was released, and I listened to it and I was very disappointed. The first question I had is, where'd the guitar go? The guitar just sort of like really just sort of took a step back. There were like a lot of synthesizers. And Lyson adopted a technique of drop-ins that it was really more the guitar emphasizing certain points in the music as opposed to being the instrument that is carrying the music. The instrument that was carrying the music a lot of times was the synthesizer and the bass. And you could notice this most especially in, for instance, the first track of Grace Under Pressure, Distant Early Warning. There are a couple of songs here and there where this approach actually works, like Red Sector A, which is about concentration camps. That kind of band. Rush would do a song about being an internee in a concentration camp, where he's not sure whether the soldiers who are arriving are there to help him or kill him, that's the kind of band they are. But anyway, the songs in Grace Under Pressure, the guitar had definitely taken a step back, even though there were songs specifically that kind of like had guitars and very centrally. For instance, Red Sector A, for instance, Between the Wheels. These songs they have strong guitar, but it's not carrying the weight of the song. It's the synthesizer that's doing the heavy lifting. The synthesizer is carrying the song, quite frankly. And it shows. The only song that is truly guitar driven and really works is The Enemy Within, which is the final part of the Fear trilogy, which, by the way, I think the Fear trilogy is outstanding. I'll talk about it later when I talk about recommended songs. But anyway, Grace Under Pressure was a lot more new wave, and it had a much greater pop sensibility. There was more of an effort of trying to be cool, of trying to be popular. I don't think it worked. I think that the sound, it sounded a lot like 80s albums at that time. And that's why now it feels a little bit dated. It doesn't feel timeless as other Rush albums, as timeless as Rush albums that were to come, because in just a few years, they'd sort of like reel back this failure, this tinniness, and go back to a fuller, richer sound, right? But anyway, Grace Under Pressure was the first of these thin albums. It also marked the departure of their longtime record producer, Terry Brown. Terry Brown had produced all of their albums, or co-produced all of their albums, up until Grace Under Pressure. And apparently, during the making of Signals, there had been tension as to what kind of music to include and what not. And basically, the boys gave Terry Brown the boot, and they never worked with him again, which I think was a mistake, because I think that Terry Brown really knew how to record them and bring them out insofar as recording is concerned. They never did an album as well recorded as the ones that they did with Terry Brown. The only one that comes close is Feedback, the album of covers that they released in 2004. But, Terry Brown was essential, and he knew how to record them. It's as simple as that. And this is something really important, okay? In fashion photography, there are certain models that only want to work with certain photographers because that photographer knows how to shoot them, knows how to capture them. The guy who can capture the sound or the vision of an artist is essential. That you have certain film directors who only want to work with certain cinematographers because that cinematographer knows how to capture that director's vision. And those directors who match up with the right cinematographer, you can tell, like the Coen brothers with, what's his name? His name slips my mind, Roger Deakins, right? I- You can tell how Roger Deakins and the Coen brothers, they fit. Because Roger Deakins knows how to capture their vision, knows how to shoot the scene, light the scene, so that it hits their vision, right? Terry Brown knew how to record it Rush, and it was a big mistake on Rush's part to have cut him loose. Uh, Grace Under Pressure was a badly recorded album. It sounded tinny, thin, insubstantial almost in places, which is a sadness because, see, a lot of the material was pretty good. Some of it was goddamn weak. Like, for instance, The Body Electric, that was a weakling ass song. And Terry Brown would have had the self confidence to tell them, no, boys, this song kind of sucks. You should rewrite it or scrap it, you know? But with a new producer, and Rush is a very established band by this point, they didn't have anybody telling them no. See? And so they did record a couple of songs on Grace Under Pressure, which were crappy, okay? They'd had occasional misfires before, like, for instance, Madrigal on A Farewell to Kings. God, what a piece of shit. That was a piece of shit. It was sentimental rubbish, you know? I don't know what the fuck the boys were thinking of when they recorded that goddamn song, but thank God it was only like 3 minutes long, okay, in an otherwise exceptional album, right? But, misfires here and there, they happen. But there was, you know, I'm trying to think offhand. I don't have the song list in front of me right now, but there was The Body Electric, which was pretty shitty. There was a really interesting experiment, Red Lenses, which I personally liked a lot. I thought that was a really great experiment, but it could have been better recorded. I mean, that's the thing. The whole album could have been better recorded, and Terry Brown would have known how to do that. And instead, they had this very thin-sounding album, which matched the aesthetic of that time, because so much of 80s music, especially pop music, especially non-metal music, was so thin. In fact, I would eventually argue that that's part of the reason that pop metal became so popular, because it was a thicker sound. Like a song like Rats Round and Round was full, whereas a song like I don't know, any kind of dance tune of the 80s sounds thin, insubstantial. And Grace Under Pressure, unfortunately, falls under that category of a thin sounding album. Power Windows isn't. It's chunkier from the get go. It's a lot chunkier. The guitar is back. Not so inspired as before, but it's back. Lifeson's creative trough of '84, yeah, he rebounded, and Power Windows has a lot of really great guitar. Like, for instance, The Big Money, like songs like what you call it, Mystic Rhythms, yeah. And my personal favorite, Middletown Dreams. That's an exceptional song. It's so beautiful and uses so many different guitars to really do an effect. And Power Windows, I want to focus on that a little bit on that album, because that's kind of like the pinnacle of this period of Rush. It was an album that had 8 songs, and they all pretty much worked. Although a couple of the songs that didn't work are Anagram. It was good ideas, but it's sort of like misfired. It was not a bad song. It wasn't a failure. It wasn't like a oof, how could you do that? Like Madrigal, for instance. But it just didn't quite happen. Okay, it was a clever song, clever lyrics, but it just didn't come together. That was Anagram. And Manhattan Project was just a little too, good little liberal politics kind of thing, which is kind of surprising because Rush had been accused of being fascists, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But yeah, the Manhattan Project was kind of like stupid lyrics, quite frankly, and not particularly inspired music. And that's the thing. See, you started having a band that was more professional. They weren't like blown away by the fact that they were rock musicians. They were looking at like, okay, we got to do an album. Let's go and do an album. And Power Windows has here and there elements of that, of like, we're going to do an album. There are parts of it that are like, we are really doing something cool. like Middletown Dreams, like Mystic Rhythms. Those two songs and Territories, those three songs, but principally Middletown Dreams. That's where a band is like saying, holy shit, this is cool. Mm? And I think that that's the issue of inspiration, by the way. It's when the artist, be it a musician, a filmmaker, a writer, or whatever, when he's doing something and he's like, he himself is saying, this is fucking cool. Because you see, you're a musician, you listen to music. You're a filmmaker, you watch movies, right? You're a novelist, you read novels. And what are you looking for? You're looking for that high of like, holy shit, this is really fucking cool. That's what you're looking for. You wanna feel that this is just so fucking cool. Yeah? I mean, like, anybody who loves movies, they see Apocalypse Now for the first time and they are blown the fuck away because that's a cool fucking movie. I'm not talking about the Redux version, which has all that extra footage, which is kind of garbage. No, I'm talking about the original cut. The original cut of Apocalypse Now is like, holy fucking shit, this is fucking cool. This is really fucking cool. Yeah? Yeah. And what happens when a musician, for instance, he listens to a song like Stairway to Heaven for the first time, or American Pie for the first time, or Yesterday for the first time? He's blown away, right? What happens when that same musician is writing that shit that he thinks is cool? That's inspired. That's what inspiration is. It's when the guy making the music, making the movie, making the book, making the whatever, when he is looking at the shit that he's doing and he's blown away and thinks it's cool. And he wants to continue making more of it. That's inspired. And in Power Windows, unlike Grace Under Pressure, there are several moments that are like really inspired, that you're like, whoa, this is really fucking cool. Okay? And they know that it was really fucking cool. Middletown Dreams and Mystic Rhythms are pretty much it. And pieces here and there of Territories, you know? And here we come sort of like to that end that I was talking about at the very beginning. Because I said that the key period in Rush's career was from 75 to 85. And this is where it ended, okay, with Power Windows. Because the next album that came out, Hold Your Fire, it was in many ways a disaster. It sold fewer albums than their previous ones. It was more expensive for them to produce it because they sort of like went a little bit overboard in all kinds of ways. I mean, even in the art direction, they really spent a ton of fucking money on that goddamn album. It was an overlong album. It was overwritten. There were too many songs that were uninspired, that were, very good, very workmanlike, but they were uninspired. And there were a few that were just stinkers, like Tai Shan. That was just the dumbest fucking song ever. It's about fucking China. And China sang to me. Jesus Christ, man. I mean, that was fucking cringe-inducing. I can't believe that the boys actually made that fucking song, right? But they did. Because Hold Your Fire is basically a guy, these three musicians at this point, they are in their mid-30s, and they got a lot of financial responsibilities. And they are doing something that they were excited about doing when they were in high school, okay? There's a clear sense that these are professional musicians doing an album. They don't phone it in, okay? And this is a key issue because you can tell when some artist phones it in. When he just does an album, he's just doing it just to fulfill some quota he has with a label, right? Rush did not phone it in with Hold Your Fire. They really worked on it. And some of it is pretty fucking interesting and inspired. Like, for instance, Time Stands Still, Force 10, which is a really cool song. It's the opening track. Prime Mover, that's also a really good track. But there are so many other tracks on this album that are just filler. They're just filling up that DVD. They want to get an hour's worth of music, right? Instead of doing what they should have done, which is do 35 minutes, maybe 40 minutes, and leave it at that. Tighter, right? But they didn't. They had all these tunes, and none of them are bad. A lot of them are pretty decent, but none of them are great. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of like they weren't inspired. Hold Your Fire is an uninspired album in so many ways, even though there are a couple of high points in it and a couple of songs that are pretty decent. Uh, but it just didn't really, no, no, not at all. And then starting in 89, you have what I call a musical ratatouille, which is basically they just started throwing in all kinds of different influences because you could tell that the boys began to grow in separate musical directions. But when they'd come together, they'd mix up all their styles, and they're at a point in their careers where they're not intimidated by one of their peers throwing in something random. They just decide, oh, we'll work around this or work with it or figure it out somehow. They're not like going to have a fight and break up the band over it, you know? And so you have like this hodgepodge of music, but it's not inspired. It's not hungry. It's great craftsmanship, but it's not great, okay? I mean, Presto was the first of this period, and Presto has a lot of really, really good songs. I mean, really good songs. Incredibly well-crafted songs. Show Don't Tell, which is the first track on the album, has the weirdest fucking guitar riff ever, yeah? But Available Light, for instance, which is I think the last track, is just one of the Rush's best songs actually. From a craftsman-like perspective, it's just really just a great song. It's got The Pass, which is a really extraordinary song about suicide. And like I said before, it's a song that you should give somebody who's contemplating suicide. I think that it is the best suicide prevention song ever. Yeah, it really is. Because, like I said before, Peart just nails down the topic, nails it right down, right up against the wall. And it works, yeah? And there are a lot of other songs. And Presto is, how can I put it? It's their very best workmanlike album. Because the whole thing, every track after track, is interesting, has something going for it. Okay? Scars, for instance, it has a use of drum machines. It's like basically a dance track, but with very creepy lyrics. It's a really cool song. Okay? And like I said, there's a lot of good shit in Presto. And you have all of this influence of different musical styles. Like, for instance, Scars is basically a dance track, whereas Available Light is like a slow jazz song at some seedy bar somewhere. It's really weird, and yet it combines this grandiose and rather spectacular chorus section, which is really great. You'd have to listen to it for yourself, but the point is that, see, they sort of like just start throwing everything into the pot, like a ratatouille, and it kind of works. They are masters at being able to fuse all these different musical styles and different musical moods and bring it all together. Okay? And so they did that with Presto. And then Roll the Bones, they did it, but also it was sort of like a step back because it felt thin. It felt like a very thin album in terms of its sound, like something they would have done in that new wave metal period that I discussed previously. It really did feel like a step back, even though there was more of this, throwing everything in the pot kind of vibe. I mean, they even have a rap section of all things. This is back in 91 when it was released, and rap was just beginning to hit the mainstream. And they did this really fucking bizarre, incredibly angular and erudite rap. It was just fucking weird. And it kind of worked, weirdly enough, But anyway, that was the thing, that they could just throw in things into the mix, and it would kind of work. They would be able to bring it together like a good ratatouille, like a good, they were able to do it somehow. Counterparts is probably the best album of this period. This period of where they're basically like gliding, okay? They already did the major work of their career, and they're gliding. And there are a lot of songs on Counterparts which are fun and good, but like I said, nothing really, really inspired, okay? It's very good, very well crafted, but nothing that really blows your socks off, okay? And the weird thing is that they went through this period, Test for Echo, and then right after Test for Echo, there was this huge tragedy that happened to Neil Peart that I have to discuss briefly. Neil Peart's daughter was killed in a single car accident. She was 19 years old, and she was his only daughter. And of course, it was a disaster for Neil Peart himself, as he said. And of course, it was a disaster for his wife. And his wife quickly developed cancer, and she was dead within a year of the death of their daughter. Excuse me. And that is a tragedy. That's really just tragic to basically lose your family within a year's time. His daughter to a car accident, his wife to cancer. Peart himself said that, or wrote rather, that his wife basically committed suicide by cancer. She just gave up, she just lost the will to live. And that is just heartbreaking. I mean, it really is. But, you know, that was basically a hiatus for Rush. And as you can see there, it was basically 6 years before the next album, the longest span of time between any two albums of Rush's career. And eventually they came out with Vapor Trails. And Vapor Trails, when it came out, every Rush fan wanted it to be great because it really was remarkable that the boys were coming back. Because after such a tragedy, and after the fact that Peart didn't even play drums for several years after the death of his daughter. And Leifson said that he didn't play guitar for like a year and a half or 2 years after that tragedy either. He just didn't feel like it, just wasn't feeling it anymore. And they were off doing other shit, right? And what's interesting is that they came back for Vapor Trails, and every Rush fan wanted it to be great. And it wasn't great. It was very good. It was extremely good, but it just wasn't great. And I think that for most Rush fans, for people who had followed Rush very carefully, that's when we knew that it was over. That the glory days, the high point of Rush, it was in the rearview mirror. And they did 3 more albums. They did the cover album, Feedback, which was the best recorded album that they'd done since Signals. I can't believe that they didn't continue using that producer. Apparently they didn't. He knew how to record them. He was fantastic. Feedback sounds terrific, but it's just a covers album, okay? I mean, it's 3 professional, very, very successful musicians, very, very proficient musicians who are saying, let's fuck around with these old tunes and have fun with them. And they do. And they have a fantastic time with them. And it's just fantastic album. It's a lot of fucking fun, but artistically, it's nothing. Artistically, it's just a goof. It's just they're just fooling around, and it's not like, for instance, Eddie Van Halen's cover of "You're No Good," or of "You Really Got Me," right? Or Jimi Hendrix's cover of "All Along the Watchtower." They're not like taking an original song and really running with it and going in a radically different direction. No, they're not doing that. And Feedback it's pretty much straight ahead covers, nothing really outstanding, but it's all just fun. It's fun and good on them. I'm not going to begrudge people for having fun, of course. Okay. Snakes and Arrows was uninspired. It was uninspired. It was craftsmanlike, but it was a forgettable album. And it was the first Rush album that was forgettable, that you'd be like, yeah, whatever, It was a disappointment. It was a serious disappointment. But Rush fans, we've all kind of like pretended that it wasn't the disappointment that it actually was, but it was. And Clockwork Angels, which we already knew that was going to be it, okay? Because they'd released like 2 songs, and just recorded 2 songs and released them. And then they went on tour like, okay, we're going to record an album. And everybody was like, they're not going to record an album. They just put out these songs just to have an excuse to tour a little bit longer, but they're not going to record another album. And they didn't. I mean, eventually they did, though, but Clockwork Angels was just not inspired. It was, craftsmanlike, but not, it didn't blow your socks off. Okay? Although the weird thing is that when you listen to it, and especially you listen to the end songs, you realize that they knew then that this was it, that this was the end of the line. Okay? And yeah, they did a tour in support of this album in 2012. And then they did a couple of mini tours after that. In 2015, they did the R40 tour, which was a 40th anniversary tour, but no new music, just a tour. And they didn't say that it was a farewell tour, but everybody knew it was a farewell tour. Everybody knew it. They just run out of gas, you know? At that point, by 2015, these men are what, in their 60s? They're 62 and 63? Yeah. They're 62 and 63 years. Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson are 63. And Peart is, excuse me, Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson are 62 in 2015. And Peart is 63. And Peart is married again. Good on him. Married again with a new daughter. New wife and new daughter, new family. Good on him. You know, it was a wonderful knowing that he had lost his first child and his first wife, but he'd been able to find somebody new and have a child with her, and good on him, you know? And everybody was, obviously the Rush fans knew about it, but it's always been a weird thing with Rush fans because we kind of like know, but don't really want to know because we know that the boys want to keep their privacy. And so we're always like curious as to what they're doing, but at the same time kind of like laying off, right? So anyway, Clockwork Angels was the last album. The R40 tour was the last tour. And they played in LA's Coliseum. And the last song they played was Working Man. And it was a fucking blazing performance. It was blazing and it was great. And they were in tip-top form. And that was that. And at the time, everybody knew that that was it. Nobody said it's over, this is the farewell tour, but everybody got the picture. And then in early 2020, it was announced out of the blue that Neil Peart had died of brain cancer. Nobody had known about it. Or let me phrase that, the public hadn't known about it. His very close friends and family, of course, knew all about it, knew it had been a 3-year struggle, over 3 years, of brain cancer. And in the end, he passed away. And that was that. And that's the end of Rush, you know? Because Rush really was Lee, Lifeson, and Peart. And Lee and Lifeson, they might go on to make some more music, although they haven't made any moves in that regard. They might make some more music together, but it's never going to be Rush. And in a very real sense, you know, Rush is over, and Lee and Lifeson, they're doing other shit. You know, Lee published a really great book on bass guitars, this big, fat coffee table book with all kinds of pictures of all kinds of beautiful basses, really an extraordinary book, you know, and yeah. But by the way, I skipped over in this period, the musical Ratatouille period, I skipped over the fact that they did solo projects in the mid-90s. Peart did some big band albums, tributes to Buddy Rich, where he assembled a big band, and a big jazz band, that is, and brought in these famous drummers, all kinds of different drummers, and had them play these big band jazz standards. And they were great. They were terrific, you know. And Lifeson put out a solo album called Victor, which was very interesting. And Lee put out a solo album in 2000 during the hiatus following Neil Peart's tragedies. It was called My Favorite Headache. And My Favorite Headache was written with Ben Mink. And it was very clearly trying to be like Rush without Rush, but with Geddy Lee's vocals. It didn't really work, you know? It wasn't, it was, again, it was craftsman-like, but not inspired, okay? And the whole album is pretty forgettable, okay? I mean, if we're being really honest. And Victor, yeah, it's kind of forgettable too. It's not that big of a deal, yeah? Besides those 3 solo projects, you know, the boys really never did anything else outside of Rush. And yeah, this was their career. This is the things that they did. And as I've discussed here, you know, it's clear that the real high points were starting in 75 up to 85. That was the key decade, okay, of musical development, of inspiration, of just incredible growth. You know, this was it. This was the period. And like I said at the beginning, you know, this is, I would say, the single greatest leap of any group of musicians in a band in popular music, eclipsing even the Beatles. Because look, there's no question that the Beatles, between I Want to Hold Your Hand and Let It Be, that was a fucking quantum leap. No fucking around, right? And everything in between, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields Forever, all that shit. I mean, great albums, right? I mean, whole albums that were great, White Album, Revolver, and whatnot. But I'd argue that Rush's leap, or no, not leap, its growth between 75 and 85 was greater than the Beatles between 63 and 70. Rush grew more. They grew more. They covered more ground. Okay, they really did. It's extraordinary. And the more you look at it and study it and just analyze it, the more you realize it. And how can I put it? When Grace Under Pressure came out, and there's that decay, you know, it's sad, but that's the way of life. I mean, like all of the Beatles, after the Beatles, McCartney and Lennon and Harrison, they continued to have a solo career, and Ringo Starr too. But they weren't nearly as brilliant as when the Beatles were together, right? And they had occasional flashes of brilliance. I mean, Lennon's Instant Karma, McCartney's what you call it, Live and Let Die. Yeah, they had their moments here and there that were really incredible. Say, that was a great McCartney tune. But it just didn't really, it wasn't as great as when they were in the Beatles. And they were great in the Beatles because they were growing. And that's the thing. In any artist, it's when they're growing that it's really extraordinary. It's really like, wow, that is cool. Yeah. And so Rush, they had that period, 75 to 85. And man, it was extraordinary. And they made like a lot of fucking music that is just unbelievable. Mm-hmm. And so to begrudge them for their, slow slide down to earth, that's silly. Okay? I mean, me personally, as a grown man, and thinking of them as what they are, professional musicians, I admire the fact that they relentlessly tried to give as good as they could in every album. Because I look at every single album and I know how hard it must have been to do every album that they did. The writing of it, the producing of it, recording it, everything. It must have been so goddamn hard. And then to tour it. So much effort and energy spent and thought. And they were giving it the best that they could through Grace Under Pressure, Power Windows, Hold Your Fire, Presto, Roll the Bones, Counterparts, Test for Echo, Vapor Trails, Feedback, Snakes and Arrows, Clockwork Angels. So much work. And you cannot point, okay, I was about to say, you cannot point to any really shitty song. A couple of shitty songs here and there, yes. Tai Shan, for instance, famously, okay? But in general, they were giving it their all, as much as they could. But what happens is that, see, when you compare that to their like brilliance, their salad days, those days of wine and thunder, you know what I'm talking about? It's like heartbreaking. But greatness is always fleeting. You got to understand that. Greatness lasts just for a moment, and then it's gone, and it's not coming back. And you might be able to briefly recapture a little bit of that greatness. You might be inspired in one particular song, and there are several songs, like I mentioned, in their fading career, that were really great. Middletown Dreams is the one that pops up for me time and time again, and Animate from Counterparts, that was, and from Presto, Available Light. God, that was a beautiful song. Just an amazing tune, But you got to keep in mind that you might be recapture a little bit of that lightning, but you can't go back to that thunder that was all the time, ever present. It happens and it's gone. And so I personally just want to revel in the greatness that was Rush, and overall admire their career, because it was such an incredible career. It was such an incredible development and achievement, It really was. And it's a testament to willpower. Because I think that ultimately what these guys had was just an iron determination. You ever hear them talk in an interview, any one of them, they're always just so polite, so laid back and easygoing. No arrogance to them, no attitude, not at all. On the contrary, just incredibly down to earth and easygoing people. Yeah. And you listen to interviews from any decade of any one of the three, and they're always the same, just the nicest guys. And yet that niceness and easygoing nature hid or camouflaged an iron will, an iron discipline. Because do you have any idea how hard it is to achieve in a career like I've laid out here in front of you? It's incredibly difficult. And they pulled it off. And that's just amazing. That is just wow. Now, I'm going to explain why Rush matters to me. Because up to this point, I hope I've explained why Rush matters to everyone in general. But as a band, historically, whatnot. But to me, and I think that perhaps to a lot of other Rush fans, the same thing applies. See, to me, Rush's music was always complex, but it was viscerally exciting. Because it appealed to both my heart and my mind, or my gonads and my hindbrain, or whatever the fuck. Yeah? The first thing that struck me about them was their odd time signatures. Because, when I was growing up, I would listen to, like when I was a child, I would listen to nursery rhymes, row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. And then I listened to pop tunes like the Beatles. We all live in a yellow submarine, yellow submarine, yellow submarine. And then I remember listening to the first single I bought. I bought it when I was 6 years old. It was Billy, Don't Be a Hero. Billy, don't be a hero. Ba, 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 ba. I forgot the lyrics, but you see? And then I got into disco, swear to God. There's Rod Stewart and the Bee Gees, Fever night, fever night, fever. We don't have to show it. Or lyrics to that effect. I actually forgot. But then I listened to Jacob's Ladder off of Permanent Waves. Jacob's Ladder was actually the first Rush song I ever heard. And it was the weirdest fucking thing. The clouds prepare for battle in the dark and brooding silence. Bruised and sullen storm clouds have the light of day obscured, looming low and ominous in twilight premature. Thunderheads are rumbling in a distant overture. What the fuck is that? Huh? Rhythmically, it was incomprehensible to me at that time, right? And it just sucked me in. That kind of weird time signature, it just sucked me in. It was just so complicated. I had to be paying attention to the music. I couldn't just put it in the background and have it repeat over and over again. I had to pay active attention to it. Okay? But at the same time, what was interesting is that so much of progressive or art rock, right, progressive rock or art rock was and is incredibly complex, but it's boring. It's tedious. And worse even, it's pretentious. But Rush wasn't. See, they knew when to change. They knew that they'd done something a little bit self-indulgent and then they'd move on to something else. I mentioned earlier Buckethead. I love Buckethead, right? But he can get really tedious and boring. I mean, he's so in love with his technical ability that, it gets boring. Yeah? And a lot of art rock is like that. A lot of progressive rock, a lot of noodling around. They just do shit for hours and hours, and it goes kind of nowhere. And Rush didn't have that. They knew when to change, when they'd push their luck insofar as some musical idea, and it was time to flip it and do something different. And I think what was going on is that they got bored with it. And so as much as they might have liked something, the fact that they were so grounded and easygoing, as I mentioned before, and lacking in personal pretension, I think that saved them from being overindulgent. I think that saved them from doing pretentious, boring, tedious shit. See? Yeah. I think that that's a key reason that why I found Rush's music so viscerally exciting, because whenever they were doing something complex, just when it was becoming a little bit tedious, they repeated it one time enough, they'd change it. And so that's why I never found them boring. I was always hooked on their complexity. And the fact that they had this big, loud, strong sound that was viscerally exciting, that just added more to it, you know? And see, of all their material, I'm not talking about just their peak material of 75 to 85, but all of their albums, right? It covers such a wide range of moods and tones and speeds that there's always like a Rush song for a particular feeling or a particular moment or a particular mood, you know? And that kind of sense that Rush can be the soundtrack band for your entire life. Yeah, very much so. Yeah. Now, their lyrics, of course, spoke to me as an alienated suburban teenager who read too much, because Rush has always been an educated band, but never pretentious. You know, you listen to a song like Between the Wheels, right? And the whole song is just basically a history lesson. It's all references to historical moments or historical occurrences. You have to be very well read to understand their lyrics and the references that they're making. Because Rush always assumed that you were an adult. They never talked down to you. Okay? That's a key issue. They 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 looked at you as an equal. Okay? It was never that they're like really smart and you're dumb. And it was never that, they were pretending to be below you and sucking up to you. A lot of bands do that. A lot of bands, they basically try to suck up to you and play up to you. Like, for instance, U2. U2 is a classic band in that regard. They suck up to you. They try to make you feel cool. Hmm. But they don't talk to you as an equal. And I suspect secretly they look down on you. Bands that do that, like Springsteen, like U2, they they sort of like suck up to you, but I think that they fundamentally look down on you. Mhm. They're hiding that fact. And occasionally it's revealed and you notice it and you see it, that they're like looking down on you and thinking you're just stupid plebes. But Russia was never like that. They talked to you like an adult, but never talked down to you, okay? And never sucked up to you, okay? It was just right, that Goldilocks mix, you know? Now, the thing that happened to me that was really a big deal was when I got into Rush, I, of course, started reading the music press about Rush. And the music press about Rush was consistently negative. They called them fascists. They called them stupid, pretentious, boring, this, that, the other. They called them all kinds of things. And they called them, not only did they describe them in certain ways, or characterize them rather in certain ways, which, you can't really argue with the characterization, okay? But they would say things about Rush that were objectively not true. And it's how I got red pilled. Because they would say things and basically dismiss Rush, but I would listen to the bands that these music critics love so much. And I would just basically say, you're full of shit. You're just totally full of shit. I mean, the band that I always think of when I think of this pretension of the music press is Bell and Sebastian. Bell and Sebastian, if you don't know, is just an incredibly microscopically minor band, okay, of no importance whatsoever. But the music press was all over them in the late 90s and early 2000s. Bell and Sebastian were like the belle of the ball, and they were just nobodies. They were like this shoegazing band that had zero musical interest. They were just dull as dishwater. I mean, boring, boring, boring. And the musical press was all over these fucking people, right? This band was supposed to be the greatest thing ever. And I'm like, what's interesting about them? They can't play their instruments. Their music, their songs are boring and stupid. They've got no lyrics. They're nothing. And they don't even record their fucking pieces of shit song properly. They don't even know how to place a fucking microphone in front of a fucking amp, for crying out loud, without shredding it with feedback. With not the cool kind of feedback like the Jimi Hendrix feedback, but the bad feedback of just Bell and Sebastian. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, they would lionize these bands. And I'm singling out Bell and Sebastian, but there's been tons of bands like this where the music press Rolling Stone magazine, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and all these fucking people, these people who want to be gatekeepers, these people who want to rule the roost, would shit on Rush and put them down precisely when they're doing their best work. It's something that a lot of other musicians noticed. There was a documentary a few years ago called Behind the Stage about Rush, and they interviewed a bunch of musicians, really big ones, okay? And a lot of them were saying, just when when Rush was putting out their best material, the music press was shitting all over them. What the fuck is that all about? Yeah, that's how I got red pilled. Okay, it was of course a slow process. It wasn't like all of a sudden presto chango, I see the world through different eyes, but slowly, little by little, I understood. I understood what was going on, the bullshit that was going on, and that the press were full of shit. They were lying sacks of shit. Because I was listening to Rush, and I was living in Chile, and they talk about Chile, and what they were saying was just bullshit. I was there, and what they were saying was just not accurate. I was living under the Pinochet dictatorship, and they were saying things about Chile and living under the Pinochet dictatorship, which I knew for a fact were not true because I was there. And they were saying shit about Rush, which I knew for the fact wasn't true because I listened to their fucking music. And I knew enough about music, even though I was a shitty player, but I knew enough to know that what they were doing was extraordinary. And these fuckers are shitting all over them. That's when I got red pilled. That's when I knew that the press were lying. And if the press are lying, what about the history books? What about all these other authority figures? Are they telling the truth or are they bullshitting too? And that's how it started for me. And Rush was a key component of that. Okay? So that's why, part of the reason that Rush matters so much to me personally. And finally, something that as a much older man, I so admire and respect, which I touched on briefly before, their relentless consistency and work ethic. It's unbelievable. I look at that consistency and that hard work, even when they weren't feeling it. I mentioned how Lifeson just wasn't feeling it for Grace Under Pressure. He was just not into it, right? But he still pushed and delivered some shit that was really fucking good, okay? Maybe not so inspired as what he laid down in, tracks like Circumstance, right? Or whatever other album in the high point, in the high water mark, right? It wasn't La Villa Strangiato, perhaps, but it was still fucking good, That work ethic of sticking to it, it's something that I don't always follow, but it's always my ideal to be that consistent, to be that hardworking and relentless, That is just something that I so admire and respect, and I wish I had more of it, I am not the man that they are. Quite frankly, they are better men than me in that regard. Perhaps I'm better than them in a lot of other things, but in that regard, that consistency, that hard work ethic, they're better than me. And frankly, it's more important that that kind of consistency and work ethic is more important than being brilliant, having a lot of IQ points and shit like that. In my own case, a lot of times I fell back on the fact that I was so smart to get away with the fact that I was lazy. These fuckers, they never stopped. They kept it up at a high level. They made it a point to give their fans money for value. That's something that I so respect, and it's something that I try hard to emulate. Yeah, and I wish I'd made more of an effort to emulate it when I was younger, But, well, you live and learn. So anyway, that's why Rush matters to me, okay? And as you can see, it's just, it might be the same for you. If you're a Rush fan listening to this, it might be something completely different. So do tell me in the comment section. And finally, for you guys who are neophytes, here is my guide to listening to Rush. Now, fans are going to go ape shit over this list because they're going to say that I'm full of shit, that I don't know what I'm talking about, or they're going to say that I'm a genius, I'm a god because I hit it right on the money because, of course, this is total taste, okay? Trent Reznor loves everything by Rush after Signals. Signals, Grace Under Pressure, Hold Your Fire, all that shit. And I'm not that keen on it, And so there's Rush for everybody. This is my list, okay? There are four lists actually, because I'm a Rush fan, and of course one list is never going to be fucking enough because I'm a Rush fan. Just like Rush themselves and every other Rush fan, we have to be completists. So I have four lists. The first list is starting from zero, the albums to listen to in order. Then starting from zero, the songs to listen to in order. Then the third list is the most important albums, and then the most important songs. Okay? Okay, so here goes. Starting from zero, the albums to listen to in order are Permanent Waves, Moving Pictures, 2112, Presto, and Fly By Night. Now, Permanent Waves, the first one to listen to. If you've never heard Rush, this is the album to listen to. Why? It's the most fun. It's fun. It's cheerful. That's the underlying feel of it. It's a cheerful album. You can tell that the three musicians making this album are fucking happy, that their lives are going fucking great. And, it just comes through in the music, okay? And the music is fantastic. It's incredibly complex and hard-hitting and big and wow, and it just feels tremendous, right? But at the same time, a lot of it is very thoughtful. And the final lyrics of Natural Science, man, the most endangered species, the honest man, will still survive annihilation, forming a world state of integrity, sensitive, open, and strong. God damn, those aren't exactly the final lines of the album, but they're like the penultimate lines. But god damn, that is some powerful shit. You know what I'm saying? And the whole fucking thing is just fucking good. And also, it's the shortest Rush album, and it just hits you. It just hits you square between the eyes. I mean, it just clocks you like Mike Tyson, man. I mean, it's just really on the money. Then the next album is Moving Pictures, which unsurprisingly was the follow-up album to Permanent Waves. The first half of it is great. The second half, Vital Signs, is a fantastic song. Fantastic, one of the greatest songs, actually. Witch Hunt is very, very good. And Camera Eye, it's fine, but it's a bit filler, okay? But the first half of Moving Pictures, Tom Sawyer, Red Barchetta, YYZ, and Limelight, fantastic. Also, a lot of, I remember this music guy at a record shop. He was the manager of a record shop. He always thought that Red Barchetta, or Red Barchetta, as you pronounce it, I don't know which way you pronounce it, never have known. But anyway, Red Barchetta is like the prototypical Rush song. And that's kind of true. It's got intricate time signature changes. It's got program music. It's got it all, So, yeah. But anyway, then 2112. That is the third album to listen to after Permanent Waves and Moving Pictures. 2112 is like the first masterpiece, because Rush did several masterpieces, but 2112 is the undisputed first one, okay? And I'm talking about both the album and the song cycle, because the album has those extra tunes that I mentioned, Passage to Bangkok, Twilight Zone, whatnot, that are fantastic, and they're old standbys, right? But 2112, the song cycle, that's where you want to go. Presto is of their later period, and it's very accessible. It's an extremely accessible album, and it's very eclectic. That was the word I was searching for throughout the previous part of the presentation, eclecticism. Yeah, it's very eclectic. It covers a lot of ground, and it's a lot of fun. It's a fun album, okay? Again, it's an album that you feel that the boys are in a really good headspace and that they're enjoying what they're doing. They're not so inspired as the previous albums I've mentioned, but they're in a good place. And Fly By Night has a certain excitement of bringing in Neil Peart and going all of a sudden in a direction that they really wanted to go. Because Neil Peart, how can I put it, the previous drummer, John Rutsey, he had liked being Canadian Zeppelin. But Lee and Lifeson had really wanted to go in more interesting musical directions. And Peart wanted to go there too. And so there's that sense of discovery of like, we could all go there together, okay? And this is the first step of all of us going there together, okay? So it's a good album, yeah. It's my, it's the fifth album I'd listen to if I were starting from zero, okay? Now the songs to starting from zero, Tom Sawyer. That's the prototypical Rush song. And then Working Man. But there are lots of live versions of Working Man that you should check out. There's even one where they basically started off like a ska song. Not even ska, like a low key, low rev reggae song. Okay, not ska. Yeah, it was reggae really, and it just works really well because Working Man is a heavy metal tune, and instead they start fucking around and just playing it like it's a reggae tune and like really laid back, right? Just really just like taking it easy, you know? And it works like a charm. It works really damn well. Yeah, but Working Man is a tough, tough song. It's a cool song. Yeah. Fly By Night is like just a happy tune. Subdivisions. It talks about suburban life. It's a song that I listened to it, the day it came out. And Subdivisions spoke of my own suburban existence. And it really hit me hard. It really hit me hard. And I think that it's one of their best songs. It describes suburban living and the suburban nightmare that it is, of isolation and alienation. And it's a really, really good song. Then Spirit of Radio is just cheerful. And Limelight, like I talked about before, is about the perils of fame. La Via Strangiato is the ultimate instrumental, okay? This guy, what's his name, from Pantera, once said in some interview, he said that, yeah, guys who are playing music, they'd say, oh, yeah, can you play YYZ? Sure. But can you play La Via Strangiato? That separated the boys from the men. Yeah, that's very true. La Via Strangiato is exceptionally difficult to play. Whether you be a guitarist or a bassist or a drummer, it's fucking hard, okay? It's goddamn fucking hard. And it's it's incredibly cool, okay? And if you meet anybody who can play it, know that that fucker is a god of their instrument, okay? Whatsoever the instrument that they're playing, because all three parts of it are exceptionally difficult to play. Yeah. Available Light off the Presto album. That is a great song. That is a great, great song because what's interesting about it is that it goes through so many moods. It starts off, like I mentioned before, like this with this jazz piano, but very gentle, like it's the end of the night at a seedy jazz club. And then it goes into this very grandiose, overwhelming, kind of spectacular chorus. That's really just amazing. It's just an amazing tune. Yeah. And when it came out, I was like, oh, that's fine. That's nice enough. But over the years, I've learned to appreciate it more and more, which is always a good sign. When you start listening to a song once and, you listen to it then 20 times and you feel that it's stronger the more you listen to it, that's the mark of a great song. 2112, yeah, absolutely. It's just an amazing, the suite of songs I'm talking about. And Xanadu. Xanadu, like I said, is basically the macro version of Tom Sawyer, okay? Basically the same kind of, it's a totally different song, of course. They're not like self-plagiarizing or any shit like that. But the same stylistic elements are present in Xanadu and Tom Sawyer. Only Tom Sawyer is like tighter, stronger, more direct. But Xanadu like covers it first, It's an amazing song. Now, in terms of like the most important albums of their career, I did this list, but now that I think about it, it might be a little bit silly because it doesn't really matter. I put here Permanent Waves, Hemispheres, Moving Pictures, Signals, and Farewell to Kings. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, it was the period of time. That's what matters. The individual album, which is more important. Hemispheres is more important than Permanent Waves. Now that I look at it and I'm talking to you about it, I don't know. That's kind of stupid. Who gives a fuck? The important thing is that this period from 77 to 82, yeah, that was like the high point of their career. Yeah, those 5 albums, Farewell to Kings, Hemispheres, Permanent Waves, Moving Pictures, Signals, that was the high watermark, And the most important songs, yeah, again, it's the word important, I think, is what's tripping me up because now that I think about it, it's just a little bit silly, okay? It doesn't really matter. And I'm putting them all there, and I'll just read them off if you're just listening to this as opposed to actually watching it. I said it's Xanadu, Natural Science, Hemispheres, La Via Strangiato, Tom Sawyer, Subdivisions, the Fear Trilogy, which is The Enemy Within, The Weapon, and Witch Hunt, which are really all three cool songs, man. Limelight, Digital Man, and The Garden. The Garden, I like The Garden because it's the last song on their last album, and when they did it, it's not an inspired song. It's a well-crafted song, but it's not inspired. It's nowhere near the pinnacle of Rush. But I guess I put The Garden in there because, see, they knew it was over, okay? And you listen to that song now, knowing what happened immediately after the release of Clockwork Angels in 2012. And you know that when they wrote that song, they knew that it was over. They were done, okay? And the lyrics reflect that. And they are not nostalgic, but rather just looking back on the life that has been lived. And they knew when they recorded that song that it was over. What's surprising is that us stupid fans, when we listened to it, we didn't get the hint. You know, in 2012, I thought, oh, another Rush album. When's the next one going to come out? You know, I wasn't thinking that this was it, but they knew that it was it. Okay? Just like in 2015 when they did the R40 tour, they knew that that was it, that they were done. Okay? And yeah. They were a great band. I love Rush. They gave me such joy over the decades. Listening to their music and just, yeah, I miss them, you know? And I miss that period when they were just on fire. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I miss like listening to a new Rush song and it grabbing me by the balls, you know? Because even in their later phases, when I still feel they were not that inspired, when they were sort of like fading, they would still come out with a song that really just fucking grabbed you. Yeah? Either the lyrics or the music or a combination thereof. They would just really fucking like nail you really hard. Even in their last album, the song that really captured my attention was The Anarchist. You know? When will there be world enough and time? How does the lyric go? I forget. But it's got this great lyric. When there be world enough and time for me to sing my song, I've been so silent for so long. Yeah, that really, I thought that was so cool. Yeah, I mean, I listened to that shit when I was like, what, this is 2012, I was 44. I thought, man, that's cool shit, you know? And I'm 44 fucking years old when I'm listening to that goddamn song from that goddamn album. And, you know, it hits me that I've been listening to this goddamn band for 30 fucking years, you know? And here I am, 10 years after that. You know, it's been 40 fucking years that I've been listening to this band. But yeah, they mattered. You know, they really did. They really built something amazing. And in many ways, untouchable. There's never going to be a band like Rush, okay, that will have been so consistently creative over so many decades and will have demonstrated such an incredible development over a short period of time, those 10 years that I mentioned, or will have created such a body of work that still endures and lasts and gives people, new listeners, such joy. Yeah. You got to listen to them if you've never heard them before. And if you're an old fart fan like me, I hope that this presentation of why Rush matters has given you some ammo in case anybody says otherwise, because they do matter. It's not that they mattered past. No, they matter today. Because music, great music, is timeless. And Rush is timeless. Yeah. This is CRP. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I will catch you next time.